On the edge of wilderness, where survival balanced on the swing of an axe and the warmth of a fire, cabins were more than shelters. They were birthplaces of nations, symbols of independence, and shrines of human resilience. Each log carried stories of migration, hope, and sacrifice. From the forests of North America to the frozen frontiers of Siberia, cabins were monuments to survival, freedom, and identity. This is not just a story of wood and stone. It is the story of how humble dwellings became the foundation of civilization itself. Across the world, human survival has always begun with shelter. Yet in the history of the frontier, no structure carries as much symbolic weight as a humble cabin. To the untrained eye, it was nothing more than a rough collection of timber stacked and notched together, a roof of bark or shingles, and a hearth cut from stone. But to generations of pioneers, immigrants, and settlers, the cabin was more than a dwelling. It was a declaration. It stood as proof that human beings could enter wilderness, carve out permanence, and build the foundations of entire societies. The mystery of the cabin's enduring power lies not in its architecture, which was simple, but in what it represented. In the United States, the log cabin became synonymous with democracy and equality, a place where presidents and farmers shared similar origins. In Russia, the izba was both sacred and practical, embodying centuries of folk tradition and rural identity. In Canada, trappers and fur traders built cabins as outposts of commerce, transforming forests into international trade networks. Across Scandinavia, the timber house carried connotations of endurance against harsh climates and long winters. Everywhere it appeared, the cabin was not merely wood and stone. It was civilization asserting itself at the edge of the unknown. The origins of log construction reach back thousands of years, most often attributed to northern Europe, where dense forests of spruce and pine offered abundant resources. By the time Europeans began migrating to the Americas, log building had become a refined tradition in Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. Swedish and Finnish settlers brought with them centuries of expertise in notching, stacking, and sealing timber. To these people, the log cabin was not exotic. It was familiar, a tried and tested form of architecture. But when transplanted into the forests of North America, surrounded by vast tracts of timber and facing immediate survival needs, the log cabin took on a new symbolic dimension. It became the emblem of adaptation and resilience. The cabin's symbolism grew even stronger in the age of settlement and expansion. For new arrivals in North America, the first task was survival. Find shelter before winter. Cabins could be raised quickly, often in days, with the help of neighbors in what became known as house raisings. These communal gatherings were not only acts of construction, but also rituals of belonging. The moment a cabin was complete, a family was anchored, land was claimed, a household established, and the frontier pushed one step further. In this way, cabins were tied to the spread of European settlement, but also to conflict and displacement, as indigenous nations saw their land steadily enclosed by these wooden markers of permanence. By the early 19th century, the log cabin had evolved into a powerful political symbol. In the United States, candidates for office invoked the image of being born in a log cabin as proof of humble beginnings and closeness to the people. William Henry Harrison's 1840 presidential campaign made this image central, branding him the log cabin candidate. The strategy was so effective that the log cabin became an enduring motif in American political culture, later applied to Abraham Lincoln, whose boyhood cabin in Kentucky became one of the most famous historical icons in the nation. What began as a necessity of survival had been elevated into the mythology of democracy itself. Yet the symbolism of cabins extended beyond America. In Russia, the izba was more than a home. It was a sacred space imbued with folk beliefs. Constructed from pine or birch, the izba's interior often held a corner dedicated to religious icons, blending Orthodox faith with older Slavic traditions. These cabins reflected the endurance of rural communities, tied to land and custom, even as empires rose and fell around them. In the Canadian wilderness, Fur trappers and voyagers erected cabins as trade posts and survival shelters, extending commerce across a continent. Each cabin was both a refuge from bitter cold and a node in a network that linked remote rivers to European markets. The cabin carried deep emotional resonance because it embodied human vulnerability and determination. To build a cabin was to confront nature directly, to fell trees, split logs, raise walls, and create warmth in an unforgiving environment. In its rough beams and smoke-filled interiors, one sees both hardship and triumph. Disease, isolation, and hunger often haunted these homes, but they also witnessed births, meals, and the steady rhythm of life. The duality of the cabin, its harshness and its comfort, made it a fitting symbol of frontier existence itself. Literature and folklore ensured that cabins remained alive in cultural imagination. From tales of Daniel Boone and the wilderness exploits of American pioneers to Russian folk stories set in snow-covered izbas, cabins became backdrops for moral lessons and national identity. The cabin myth was especially powerful in the United States, where writers and politicians alike transformed it into shorthand for self-reliance, equality, and the promise of opportunity. It was no longer simply a structure of timber. It was a stage on which the American story was performed. Today, the legacy of the cabin endures not because of necessity, but because of nostalgia. Modern cabins, built as retreats or vacation homes, rarely carry the weight of survival. Yet the longing for them persists. People seek cabins as escapes from urban life, places where simplicity and solitude can be rediscovered. The cultural memory of the frontier, though softened and romanticized, still lingers in these wooden walls. In a world of concrete, steel, and glass, the cabin remains a reminder of human closeness to the land and the struggle that once defined survival. The mystery, then, is why a structure so simple still commands such respect and fascination. The answer lies in the convergence of history, myth, and identity. Cabins became symbols not merely because they sheltered families, but because they carried entire societies forward. They marked boundaries, claimed land, nurtured political ideals, and inspired myths of resilience and freedom. To understand cabins is to understand the emotional heart of frontier history. They are not just relics of wood and stone, but enduring symbols of the human will to endure, to adapt, and to belong. Long before the log cabin became an icon of frontier survival, it was a practical response to a problem that confronted nearly every human community: how to build a shelter strong enough to withstand the elements, but simple enough to construct from available materials. The story of the first timber walls begins not in the New World, but in the dense forests of northern Europe and Asia, where entire cultures adapted their lives around wood as the most abundant natural resource. Archaeological evidence suggests that the tradition of log construction reaches back to at least the Bronze Age. Excavations in Scandinavia and parts of Russia have uncovered remnants of timber dwellings dating as far back as 3,500 years ago. These early structures reveal the basic principle that would define the log cabin for millennia: whole logs, cut and laid horizontally, stacked to form walls that were both durable and insulated. The ingenuity of this method was its accessibility. Unlike stonework, which required quarrying and advanced masonry, log building demanded little more than axes, wedges, and manpower. By the early medieval period, log construction had become widespread across northern and eastern Europe. In Scandinavia, the lofting technique, joining logs by interlocking corner notches, was refined into a highly sophisticated craft. This method not only stabilized the structure, but also provided protection against harsh winds and cold winters. In Russia, the izba, constructed from pine or birch, emerged as a standard rural dwelling. These wooden houses were heated by large masonry stoves, and their walls were often sealed with moss to keep out drafts. Timber architecture was not limited to dwellings. Entire churches and fortifications were built from logs, some of which still survive as architectural treasures. The cultural reliance on timber was not accidental. Forests dominated the geography of these regions, and what was more than a building material, it was a foundation of daily life. Timber provided not only shelter but also tools, fuel, and transportation. In many Slavic traditions, trees carried sacred meaning, and the act of constructing a log house was accompanied by rituals designed to protect the inhabitants. The first timber walls, therefore, were not only physical barriers but also cultural expressions of identity and survival. When European migration began to accelerate in the 17th century, settlers carried these building traditions across the Atlantic. Among them, the Swedes and Finns stood out as masters of log construction. In 1638, a group of Swedish colonists established New Sweden along the Delaware River in what is today Delaware, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. With them came the lofting technique, which quickly spread among other European settlers who recognized its practicality in the wooded landscapes of North America. Unlike the heavy timber frame houses preferred by the English, log cabins could be built quickly, often in a matter of days, using only the labor of a family or small community. The simplicity of construction was crucial. In the wilderness, time was a matter of survival. Families arriving late in the season needed immediate shelter before the onset of winter. Log cabins met that need. Trees could be felled with axes, stripped of branches, and notched to fit together without the need for nails. The resulting walls were solid, insulated, and sturdy enough to last through harsh weather. Chimneys of stone or clay provided heat and cooking space. Roofs of bark or wooden shingles completed the structure. These cabins were not elaborate, but they were life-saving. The influence of indigenous peoples in North America also shaped the evolution of cabins. While indigenous communities did not traditionally build log structures in the same style, their knowledge of local materials, insulation techniques, and land management influenced European settlers. For example, moss and clay used to seal log walls reflected practices long familiar to native builders. Over time, the frontier cabin became a hybrid structure, European in origin, but adapted to the realities of the American landscape. As the log cabin spread across the colonies and into the expanding frontier, it came to represent a new way of life. It was not only a dwelling, but also a marker of territory. To build a cabin was to claim land and stake a future. Their symbolism was particularly strong in contested regions where settlement advanced into indigenous territories. Each new cabin was a declaration of permanence, a signal that the wilderness was being transformed into farmland and communities. The construction of cabins also had a social dimension. House raisings were among the first communal activities in new settlements. Neighbors, often separated by miles of forest, would gather to assist a family in raising their walls. The event was both practical and symbolic, a public statement that survival depended on cooperation. Music, food, and celebration often accompanied the wagon, reinforcing bonds of solidarity in otherwise isolated environments. The first timber walls, then, were not built in solitude. They were built by communities determined to survive together. Yet the log cabin was never a monolithic design. Regional variations emerged depending on geography, culture, and available resources. In the Appalachians, settlers developed saddle-notch corners that locked logs tightly together, resisting the shifting of the mountainous terrain. In the Midwest, cabins often featured clay-daubed chimneys and wide porches. On the Canadian frontier, for traders built smaller, more rugged cabins designed to withstand extreme cold and snow. In Russia and Siberia, izbas grew larger, sometimes housing multiple generations under a single roof, with elaborately carved decorations on window frames and eaves. Each adaptation reflected local conditions, but the principle of stacked logs remained constant. The symbolic resonance of timber walls extended beyond practical survival. In literature, cabins began to appear as settings for moral and national identity. The writings of early American chroniclers often described cabins as embodiments of simplicity and virtue, contrasting them with the opulence and corruption of European cities. By the late 18th century, the cabin had become a metaphor for freedom, a place where self-sufficient families could thrive, independent of landlords and monarchs. The association of cabins with liberty was so strong that political figures began invoking their humble origins as proof of their democratic character. The durability of the cabin myth owes much to the nature of its construction. Timber walls were temporary in comparison to stone or brick. Cabins decayed quickly if neglected, yet in their impermanence, they symbolize the resilience of those who built them. Families who raised cabins did not intend them to last for centuries. They built them to endure long enough to establish roots, farm the land, and eventually construct more permanent homes. In this sense, cabins represent a transition, the fragile but determined first step in taming wilderness. By the early 19th century, cabins were no longer simply shelters but cultural symbols woven into the fabric of national identity. In the United States, they became emblems of the frontier's spirit and democratic equality. In Russia, the izba remained a fixture of rural life, connecting peasants to centuries of tradition. In Canada, cabins marked the advance of trade networks into the farthest reaches of the continent. And in Scandinavia, timber houses endured as practical, sustainable responses to cold climates, later influencing modern architecture. The story of the first timber walls, then, is a story of migration, adaptation, and symbolism. What began as a simple method of stacking logs became a global architectural tradition, carried across oceans and transformed by necessity. The cabin was more than a house. It was a bridge between cultures, a weapon of colonization, a stage for democracy, and a symbol of resilience. To build a cabin was to declare a future, no matter how uncertain the present. As we look back, the mystery of the cabin's enduring legacy becomes clearer. It is not the shape of the walls or the style of the roof that matters, but the meaning those timber walls carried. They enclose families, but they also enclose ideals, survival, freedom, and belonging. From the forests of northern Europe to the untamed frontiers of the Americas, the first timber walls continue to remind us of humanity's relentless will to endure and to make wilderness into home. When European settlers first set foot on the shores of North America, they were met with an environment both overwhelming and promising. Vast forests stretched as far as the eye could see, rivers wound through uncharted landscapes, and winters arrived with an unforgiving cold. For these early arrivals, survival depended on how quickly they could transform the wilderness into a home. Among the many traditions they carried across the Atlantic, none would prove more practical or more symbolic than the skill of building with logs. The log cabin, long established in the forests of Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, would become one of the most enduring markers of settlement in the New World. The story begins in the mid-17th century. While English settlers in Virginia and New England favored timber frame houses, requiring sawmills and skilled carpentry, Swedish and Finnish colonists who arrived in 1638 brought with them a building tradition far better suited to the frontier. These settlers established New Sweden along the banks of the Delaware River, covering present-day Delaware, New Jersey, and parts of Pennsylvania. They introduced a lofting technique, interlocking corner notches that stabilized log walls without nails. For them, the endless forests of the New World offered a familiar abundance of raw material. Within days, they could raise cabins that provided insulation against harsh winters, resilience against storms, and a measure of comfort in an unfamiliar land. At first, the log cabin was distinctive to these Scandinavian communities, but its practicality quickly caught the attention of other European settlers. The Dutch, who absorbed New Sweden in 1655, adopted the method in their settlements. Later, English colonists, though initially committed to their own architectural traditions, recognized the efficiency of log building in frontier regions where sawmills were absent and labor scarce. Unlike timber frame houses, which required planks, beams, and joinery, a log cabin could be built with little more than an axe, a wedge, and muscle. For pioneers facing isolation and the constant threat of winter, this difference often meant survival. The cabin spread across the colonies coincided with a relentless expansion of settlement into indigenous lands. Each log cabin represented more than shelter. It was a claimed stake in contested territory. For native peoples, the cabin symbolized the advance of permanent settlement. Its notched corners and smoking chimneys mark a landscape being transformed, forests converted into farmland, and migratory routes closed off by fences and fields. To settlers, these cabins meant hope and security. To indigenous communities, they often signaled encroachment and dispossession. The log cabin thus became both a tool of survival and a symbol of colonial ambition. Life inside these early American cabins was austere. The typical structure measured about 15 by 20 feet, with a single room serving as kitchen, bedroom, and living space. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, providing heat and a place to cook. Windows were rare, sometimes covered only with oil paper to admit light while blocking wind. Floors were often made of packed earth, though some cabins had split log planks known as puncheons. The interiors were dark and smoky, and in the winter months, families crowded together for warmth. Yet despite their crude appearance, these dwellings offered something profoundly valuable: permanence in an unpredictable world. Building a cabin was often a communal affair. Neighbors, few and far between, would gather for house raisings, where men felled and notched logs while women prepared meals and children carried water. The raising of the walls was more than labor. It was ritual, a statement that this family had joined the settlement, that their presence would endure through storms, hunger, and isolation. These gatherings reinforced social bonds, turning isolated families into communities linked by shared survival. The cabin stood at the center of this new life, a symbol of belonging in the midst of wilderness. By the 18th century, the log cabin had become a fixture of the colonial frontier. German and Scots-Irish immigrants, moving westward from Pennsylvania into the Appalachian Mountains, embraced the tradition. Their cabins evolved with regional adaptations. In the Appalachians, saddle notch construction proved especially durable in uneven terrain. Cabins often featured lofts of storage or sleeping space, with porches extending across the front for shade. These adaptations showed how a European tradition had been reshaped by American conditions, producing a form of architecture uniquely suited to frontier life. The symbolism of cabins began to seep into colonial identity. In contrast to the stone houses of Europe, log cabins represented simplicity, equality, and self-reliance. They embodied the idea that a family, armed only with tools and determination, could carve out a life on the edge of civilization. This symbolism became particularly powerful during the Revolutionary era. As colonists cast off ties to Britain, the humble log cabin stood in contrast to the grandeur of aristocratic estates. It became an emblem of the common people, the very foundation of the new republic. One of the most famous cabins in American history illustrates this symbolism. In 1809, Abraham Lincoln was born in a one-room log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky. Though modest in size and comfort, this birthplace later became a national shrine, celebrated as a cradle of democracy and proof that greatness could emerge from the simplest origins. Long after the frontier era had passed, Lincoln's log cabin symbolized the American ideal that humble beginning could lead to extraordinary achievement. But the spread of the log cabin was not limited to the United States. In Canada, French voyagers and fur traders adapted cabins as outposts along remote rivers and lakes. These structures provided shelter in bitterly cold winters, enabling the expansion of the fur trade into the vast Canadian wilderness. Cabins were not only homes but also trading posts, linking indigenous trappers with European markets. The Hudson's Bay Company, founded in 1670, relied on cabins and forts as the backbone of its network, stretching from the Great Lakes to the Arctic. Each cabin, no matter how remote, became a node in the global economy affairs, linking forests to the fashion houses of Paris and London. Further north and east, in Russia and Siberia, the tradition of the ISBA paralleled developments in North America. Russian settlers moving into Siberia relied on log houses to survive extreme cold. Like their American counterparts, they combined practical construction with cultural meaning. The ISBA was not only a dwelling but a sacred space, with corners dedicated to religious icons and customs that linked family life to spiritual traditions. The presence of these cabins across two continents underscores a universal truth. Where forests dominated, log construction followed, carrying both survival and symbolism. As settlers pushed deeper into the interior of North America, the log cabin evolved from temporary shelter to cultural symbol. It became a backdrop for folklore, literature, and political rhetoric. Stories of frontier heroes like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett were set against the rugged simplicity of cabins, reinforcing their image as places where character was forged. In children's literature and later in popular culture, the cabin became romanticized, stripped of hardship and transformed into a nostalgic emblem of a nation's beginnings. Yet behind the mythology lay harsh realities. Cabins would be cramped, dark, and unsanitary. Diseases spread easily in confined quarters. Food supplies were precarious, and winters brought hunger as well as cold. For many families, the cabin was a place of hardship as much as it was a symbol of freedom. Indigenous communities, too, experienced the cabin differently. For them, its spread marked a steady erosion of their lands and ways of life. To celebrate the cabin as an emblem of democracy is therefore to tell only half the story. It was also a symbol of dispossession and colonial expansion. Despite these contradictions, the cabin's legacy endured. By the early 19th century, it had been woven into the national consciousness. Political candidates used the imagery to appeal to voters, most famously in the 1840 log cabin campaign of William Henry Harrison. Supporters built log cabins on wagons, rolled them through cities, and distributed hard cider to crowds, presenting Harrison as a man of the people. The log cabin, once a crude necessity, had become a potent political brand. The arrival of the log cabin in the New World thus marked more than a shift in architecture. It marked a shift in identity. It bridged continents, carrying traditions from Europe into the forests of America, adapting to new landscapes, and embedding itself into the midst of settlement and democracy. To this day, the cabin remains a powerful cultural symbol, celebrated not for its form but for its meaning, resilience, equality, and the human will to endure. The frontier was never a fixed line on a map. It was a moving edge, advancing steadily westward across forests, rivers, and mountains as settlers expanded into lands long inhabited by indigenous peoples. On that edge, survival was uncertain, isolation was constant, and the environment was often hostile. For the men, women, and children who carved out their existence there, the log cabin was more than a roof over their heads. It was a shield against hunger, predators, weather, and fear. Shelter on the frontier was not only a practical necessity, but a defining feature of life, a structure that embodied resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. The cabins built on the frontier varied in design and size, but they shared common traits born of necessity. They were typically small, one- or two-room structures, constructed with logs felled from nearby forests. Corners were secured with saddle notches or V-notches, depending on regional practice. Cracks between the logs were filled with clay, mud, moss, or straw, a process called chinking and daubing. Roofs were covered with overlapping wooden shingles or even bark peeled from trees. Inside, a stone fireplace or clay chimney dominated, serving as the heart of the home, the source of heat, and the place where meals were cooked. These cabins were cramped and dimly lit, often with only a single door and one or two small windows. Yet for settlers facing the wilderness, they meant survival. The importance of shelter became especially clear during the brutal winters of the frontier. Without proper protection, exposure could quickly turn fatal. Cabins, even with their drafts and smoky interiors, offered insulation that tents or lean-tos could never match. Thick log walls trapped heat, and the hearth provided a constant flame that burned through long nights. Families often crowded together in one room, sleeping in lofts or on straw-filled mattresses placed near the fire. The smell of wood smoke permeated everything: clothing, bedding, food, but it was a small price for warmth. In many cases, the difference between life and death on the frontier came down to how quickly a family could build its first cabin before the onset of winter. Beyond physical protection, cabins carried psychological weight. They offered settlers a sense of permanence in an environment that otherwise seemed endless and uncertain. To step inside a cabin was to enter a space of order and control, however fragile, carved out from the wilderness. The act of closing a wooden door against the night, of hearing the crackle of a fire within log walls, gave settlers confidence that they had staked a claim to survival. Cabins were not only shelters of wood, but also shelters of the mind. Cabins also served as fortresses in times of danger. On the frontier, conflict with indigenous peoples was a constant reality. For native nations, cabins and the farms they anchored represented the steady erosion of their lands. Raids and reprisals were common, and settlers fortified their cabins as best they could. Logs provided a measure of defense against arrows and musket fire, and small openings were sometimes cut into walls to allow settlers to fire from within. In more dangerous regions, multiple families clustered together in blockhouses, larger fortified cabins designed to withstand attack. These were not merely homes, but strongholds, tangible symbols of contested space. Daily life within frontier cabins reflected both hardship and ingenuity. Food was cooked over open hearths in iron pots or on spits. Cornmeal, wild game, and preserved vegetables made up much of the diet. Water had to be hauled from streams or wells, sometimes at great distance. Furniture was crude, often built on site from split logs or rough-hewn boards. Beds were simple frames strung with rope or filled with straw. Despite their sparseness, cabins held the rhythms of domestic life. Children learning to read by the light of the fire, women spinning or sewing, men repairing tools after a day's labor. Within their walls, families attempted to replicate the order of the homes they had left behind in Europe or the Eastern colonies. The role of the cabin as shelter extended beyond families. Cabins became meeting places, trading posts, and even makeshift churches. On Sundays, neighbors might gather in the largest cabin in the settlement for religious services. Teachers sometimes used cabins as schools, instructing children with little more than slates and chalk. In emergencies, cabins served as hospitals, their smoky interiors filled with the smell of herbs and the sound of prayers. In these ways, the cabin was more than a personal refuge. It was a communal anchor in a landscape where communities were fragile and scattered. The symbolic power of the cabin as shelter became part of the mythology of the frontier. Writers of the 18th and 19th centuries often depicted cabins as a first step toward civilization. Where a cabin stood, fields would follow. Where fields spread, towns would grow. The log walls of a single cabin represented the transformation of wilderness into society. This narrative, however, often obscured the realities of indigenous displacement and ecological change that accompanied settlement. The shelter of one family's cabin frequently came at the expense of another community's home. Still, the image of the cabin as sanctuary persisted. Accounts from settlers themselves reveal how deeply tied their sense of security was to these structures. Letters and diaries often describe the relief of completing a cabin before winter or the comfort of hearing a storm rage outside while fire burned within. These testimonies capture the profound gratitude settlers felt toward their shelters. In an environment of relentless uncertainty, cabins provided stability, however modest. The endurance of cabins on the frontier also depended on maintenance. Logs settled and shrank over time, creating new gaps that required constant rechinking. Roofs leaked and had to be repaired. Chimneys cracked or collapsed. Settlers invested continual labor into their homes, reinforcing their status as living structures, always imperfect, always demanding attention, but always central to survival. The shelter of the frontier cabin was not static. It was dynamic, evolving with the seasons and the needs of its inhabitants. Shelter on the frontier also carried symbolic contrasts. For settlers, cabins were symbols of progress, proof that they had established themselves in new lands. For indigenous peoples, they were symbols of intrusion, marking the loss of hunting grounds, villages, and mobility. The clash of these perspectives defined the frontier as much as the cabins themselves. The shelter that settlers cherished was, for others, a harbinger of displacement. The dual meaning of the cabin as both sanctuary and threat remains one of the most powerful aspects of its legacy. As the frontier continued to expand, cabins multiplied, dotting the landscape from the Appalachians to the Mississippi Valley and beyond. Each new cabin marked a stage in the advance of settlement, a small fortress that were declaring that the wilderness was being transformed. Over time, cabins would be replaced by larger frame houses, barns, and eventually towns. But in the early stages of settlement, they were the essential first step, the walls that made survival possible and community conceivable. The story of frontier shelter is, in many ways, the story of human determination. Faced with the unknown, settlers turned trees into walls, fields into farms, and fear into resilience. The cabin was their tool, their fortress, their home. It represented the very essence of the frontier, the belief that with enough labor and resolve, even the harshest wilderness could be tamed. By the dawn of the 19th century, the log cabin had become more than a frontier necessity. It had transformed into a national symbol, an emblem of the values that settlers, leaders, and eventually politicians sought to claim as the foundation of an emerging American identity. Rough-hewn and modest in appearance, the cabin stood for self-reliance, perseverance, and equality. It told a story not of aristocracy or privilege, but of families who carved their existence from a wilderness with nothing but tools, strength, and determination. To call America a nation of cabins was to acknowledge how deeply these humble structures shaped its history, its culture, and even its politics. The mythology of the log cabin was rooted in the experience of millions of settlers who built them across the expanding frontier. From the Appalachian backcountry to the fertile Ohio River Valley and beyond, cabins dotted the landscape as families pushed westward. Each one stood as a marker of persistence. Cabins were not only shelters, but symbols of a distinctly American narrative. The idea that anyone, regardless of wealth or lineage, could claim land, raise wolves, and establish a future. This narrative carried enormous weight in a society eager to distinguish itself from Europe. In contrast to the stone manors and estates of the Old World, log cabins represented simplicity, democracy, and opportunity. They embodied a rejection of aristocratic hierarchy and the embrace of a new social order built on hard work. Writers, ministers, and political leaders seized upon this symbolism, turning the log cabin into a cultural shorthand for virtue and independence. By the early 1800s, the log cabin began to appear in political rhetoric. Candidates emphasized humble beginnings, and nothing conveyed humility more vividly than being born in a log cabin. This trope reached its peak in the 1840 presidential campaign of William Henry Harrison. Though Harrison himself came from a wealthy Virginia family, his supporters crafted an image of him as a log cabin candidate, a man of the people who shared the struggles of ordinary settlers. Campaigners erected log cabin replicas, rolled them through towns on wagons, and distributed hard cider in small wooden mugs to symbolize frontier hospitality. The imagery proved so powerful that it overwhelmed Harrison's opponent, Martin Van Buren, whose elite background was cast as out of touch with the common voter. The log cabin, once a practical frontier dwelling, had become a national political brand. The log cabin myth continued with Abraham Lincoln, perhaps the most enduring example of this symbolism. Born in 1809 in a one-room cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky, Lincoln's origins were celebrated as the epitome of American possibility, a poor frontier boy rising to become president. His log cabin birthplace was memorialized during his lifetime and enshrined after his death, eventually reconstructed as a shrine to democracy. The Lincoln cabin became more than a personal story. It was a collective symbol of the nation's belief that greatness could emerge from the simplest beginnings. Beyond politics, the cabin shaped cultural identity in literature and folklore. Stories of pioneers like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett often began in log cabins, which served as a backdrop for tales of courage, exploration, and adventure. In these narratives, the cabin symbolized the first step into wilderness, the fragile but resolute line between civilization and nature. By the mid-19th century, children's books and frontier tales further reinforced the cabin as a stage where character was tested and values defined. Yet the log cabin as national symbol was not without contradictions. For many settlers, life in cabins was marked by hardship, disease, and deprivation. The smoky interiors, cramped conditions, and lack of sanitation meant that cabins could be as much prisons of poverty as symbols of freedom. For indigenous peoples, cabins represented displacement and loss, physical proof of land being claimed and cultures disrupted. The national myth of cabins celebrated progress and democracy while often overlooking the costs borne by those excluded from its promise. The cabin also became an emblem of economic mobility. For poor settlers, building a log cabin was a first step on the path to stability. As families prospered, cabins were often replaced with larger frame houses or brick homes. The log cabin, in this sense, symbolized not only survival but also transition, the humble starting point on the road to prosperity. It carried the promise of upward mobility, a promise that resonated deeply in a nation built on the idea of self-made success. Cabins were woven into the collective memory through monuments and preservation efforts. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as industrialization transformed cities and new technologies reshaped daily life, nostalgia for the simplicity of the frontier grew. Historical societies reconstructed cabins associated with famous figures, including Lincoln and Harrison, and opened them to the public. These replicas, though often idealized, reinforce a log cabin as a timeless emblem of national origins. Visitors who walked through their rough wooden doors were invited to imagine themselves connected to a heritage of perseverance and democracy. The spread of cabins across the nation also mirrored the expansion of its borders. In the Midwest, log cabins dotted prairies newly opened to farming. In the South, cabins housed settlers carving farms from pine forests. In the West, cabins served as way stations, mining camps, and homesteads. Everywhere, they signaled the advance of settlement and the determination of families to endure. Each cabin, no matter how small, represented a claim to land, a family's foothold in the future, and a piece of a nation's identity. Cultural celebrations of cabins extended beyond America. In Russia, the Izba remained a national symbol of rural tradition, while in Canada, cabins marked the expansion of trade and settlement into the northern wilderness. Yet it was in the United States that the log cabin became inseparably tied to national mythology. In songs, speeches, and literature, it was celebrated as a dwelling of the common man, the cradle of democracy, and the embodiment of resilience. The endurance of this symbolism reveals a deep human need to connect identity with origins. Nations, like individuals, craft stories about where they came from. For America, the log cabin offered a narrative of simplicity, struggle, and triumph. It was a story that ignored complexity, smoothing over the darker realities of displacement and hardship, but it was a story that resonated with millions. The cabin's image, rough and unadorned, stood in stark contrast to the palaces of Europe, declaring a distinct national character. Today, the legacy of the cabin remains visible in museums, monuments, and even in popular imagination. The Lincoln cabin, enshrined at his birthplace in Kentucky, continues to draw visitors. Replicas of frontier cabins appear in historic parks and heritage villages. The cabin remains a symbol of nostalgia, evoking a time when life seemed simpler, when survival depended on grit rather than wealth, and when democracy was imagined as a home built log by log. The transformation of cabins from necessity to symbol reveals how architecture can shape identity. What began as hurried shelters for survival became emblems of democracy and equality. They were celebrated in politics, immortalized in folklore, and preserved in memory. The nation of cabins was not built of logs alone, but of ideals. That hard work created opportunity, that humble beginnings did not prevent greatness, and that the strength of a people was forged in the simplest of homes. If the log cabin was the body of the frontier home, then the fireplace was its beating heart. Within the rough walls of cabins across Europe, North America, and beyond, the hearth was the center of daily life. It provided light in darkness, heat in winter, and fire for cooking food. More than a practical necessity, it carried symbolic meaning. To settlers, the hearth was not simply a pile of stone and ash. It was a place where family gathered, where survival was secured, and where culture was passed from one generation to the next. In a world where comfort was scarce, the fireplace embodied warmth, resilience, and continuity. The earliest cabins built by European settlers in North America typically featured large fireplaces constructed from stone, clay, or a combination of both. These fireplaces dominated one side of the cabin, with wide hearths often extending several feet into the room. Their size was not accidental. On the frontier, fireplaces were expected to serve multiple roles: heating the cabin, drying clothes, cooking meals, and sometimes even functioning as makeshift ovens. A roaring fire could heat a small one-room cabin through the harshest winter, while a bed of glowing embers could keep a pot of stew simmering through the night. The construction of fireplaces was a demanding task. Stones had to be gathered and stacked carefully to form chimneys that would not collapse under their own weight. Clay or mortar was used to seal gaps, and settlers often reinforced chimneys with wooden frames plastered with mud. These early chimneys were prone to cracking or catching fire, but they were essential. A cabin without a fireplace was incomplete. It lacked not only warmth but also the means to prepare food and maintain daily life. The skill of building a secure hearth became as important as the ability to notch logs or raise walls. Cooking at the hearth was a constant task. Iron pots and kettles hung from hooks or rested on iron cranes that could be swung in and out of the fire. Bread was baked in Dutch ovens buried in embers. Meat was roasted on spits turned by hand. Soups and stews, simmering for hours, became staples because they stretched limited ingredients and required little attention once placed on the fire. For frontier families, meals were inseparable from the hearth, and the smell of wood smoke and cooking mingled in cabins as the ever-present backdrop of daily life. The hearth also defined the rhythm of the household. Families gathered around it at dawn for warmth before the day's labor, and returned at dusk to share a meal by its light. Children played at its edges, listening to stories told by parents or grandparents. Women spent long hours cooking, sewing, or spinning near its warmth, while men often used its light to repair tools or carve implements. In winter, the hearth was the only barrier between life and freezing death. Its fire tended day and night without pause. The fireplace was not only functional, but central to the very idea of home. Symbolically, the hearth carried immense cultural weight. In many societies, it was regarded as sacred, the place where domestic rituals unfolded. Ancient Roman families maintained household gods at their hearths. In Slavic traditions, icons or charms were often placed near the fireplace of protection. Among European settlers in America, the hearth inherited these meanings, becoming the stage for prayer, storytelling, and memory. To extinguish a hearth was to silence the heart of the home. To kindle it anew was to declare continuity and survival. The fireplace also marked social life in frontier communities. When neighbors gathered for visits, they sat around the hearth, sharing food, drink, and conversation. Courtships often unfolded in its glow, and marriages were celebrated in its warmth. In religious life, sermons and meetings were sometimes held in cabins, with congregations gathered around hearths that doubled as altars. The fireplace blurred the line between necessity and symbolism, uniting the practical demands of survival with the cultural rituals of belonging. Yet the hearth also reflected hardship. Smoke frequently filled cabins due to poorly designed chimneys, irritating eyes and lungs. Accidents were common. Children and adults alike suffered burns from open flames. Fire was both protector and destroyer. essential for warmth, but capable of reducing cabins to ashes in minutes. Settlers lived in constant awareness of this danger, often keeping buckets of water or sand nearby. Despite these risks, they could not live without fire, and so the hearth became a paradox, a source of life that also threatened death. Over time, hearth design evolved. As settlements grew and technology advanced, fireplaces became more efficient. In the 18th century, Benjamin Franklin introduced the Franklin stove, a metal insert that radiated heat more effectively than traditional open fireplaces. This innovation reduced the risk of sparks and conserved wood. Though on the frontier, open hearths remained common well into the 19th century. Chimney designs improved, incorporating brick where possible, and iron cookware became more widespread. These changes reflected a gradual transition from improvised survival to more stable domestic life. The cultural symbolism of the hearth extended beyond daily use. Writers and political leaders invoked it as a metaphor for national identity. The hearth stood for stability, unity, and the nurturing of future generations. In American political rhetoric, the image of families gathered around a hearth reinforced ideals of domestic virtue and self-reliance. For immigrants, the hearth symbolized both continuity with old traditions and adaptation to new lands. It was a space where cultures blended, as recipes, rituals, and languages mingled in the glow of firelight. The decline of the traditional hearth began with industrialization and urbanization. By the mid-19th century, stoves replaced open fireplaces in many homes, offering greater efficiency and safety. Later, central heating systems reduced the fireplace to a decorative feature rather than a necessity. Yet even as its practical role diminished, the hearth retained symbolic power. Literature, art, and nostalgia preserved its image as a heart of the home. In holiday traditions, from Christmas stockings hung by the chimney to stories told by the fire, the hearth continued to represent warmth, family, and belonging. On the frontier, however, its memory carried a sharper edge. For the families who had relied on them, fireplaces and hearths were not quaint symbols but lifelines. They were where meals were stretched to feed hungry mouths, where children survived freezing nights, and where parents fought to keep embers glowing through storms and famine. The hearth embodied resilience not in abstraction, but in lived reality. To understand life in a frontier cabin is to understand that the hearth was never optional. It was central, indispensable, and sacred. Even today, the hearth retains echoes of this meaning. Cabins built as retreats often include fireplaces, even when modern heating makes them unnecessary. Visitors gather around them not for survival, but for the sense of connection they evoke. The crackle of fire and the glow of embers continue to symbolize comfort, continuity, and community. The legacy of the hearth endures because it speaks to something universal, the human need for warmth, both physical and emotional, and the way fire unites people in the shared struggle of existence. Thus, when we speak of cabins as more than wood and stone, we must also speak of their fireplaces. They were not decorative additions, but the axis of survival and culture. From the lofted cabins of Scandinavia to the izbas of Russia, from the frontier shelters of North America to the trading posts of Canada, the hearth was a constant. It linked families across continents and centuries, grounding human life in the simplest but most profound of needs, the need for fire. The log cabin was not only a home. On the shifting frontiers of North America, it became a fortress, a meeting place, and sometimes a battlefield. In times of peace, cabins symbolized family, community, and survival. In times of war, they became shelters for soldiers, supply depots, and strategic markers of contested land. To trace the history of cabins in war and peace is to see how these modest structures stood at the crossroads of conflict, diplomacy, and cultural transformation. From the 17th century onward, cabins were built in regions where colonial expansion met indigenous resistance. For native nations, the appearance of cabins often marked the beginning of displacement, as permanent wooden dwellings signaled European intent to settle permanently. This tension led to violent clashes, and cabins became targets during raids and counterattacks. During King Philip's War in New England in the 1670s, entire settlements of cabins were burned as part of a broader struggle between native peoples and English colonists. These conflicts underscored the cabin's dual role. For settlers, it was protection and permanence. For indigenous communities, it was a symbol of intrusion and colonization. The French and Indian War of 1754 to 1763 further highlighted the role of cabins in warfare. In contested territories of the Ohio Valley, cabins served as forward outposts, supply stations, and rallying points. Settlers fortified their homes with palisades or converted them into blockhouses, bristling with loopholes for muskets. Cabins dotted the landscape near forts like Fort Duquesne and Fort Necessity, their presence marking the extension of European settlement into indigenous and French-claimed lands. For families, these cabins were fragile sanctuaries. For armies, they were logistical assets in campaigns that reshaped the balance of power in North America. During the American Revolution, cabins once again became central to the struggle. Many rural cabins served as safe haven for militia and Continental Army soldiers. In the back country of the Carolinas and Appalachians, they provided shelter, food, and meeting places for patriots organizing resistance. Loyalist and patriot families often lived side by side, and cabins became flashpoints in the brutal civil war within a revolution. Raids frequently targeted isolated cabins, resulting in cycles of reprisal that blurred the lines between military and civilian life. For ordinary families, the war often came literally to their doorstep, and the cabin's role as sanctuary was tested to the limit. Perhaps the most striking example of cabins in wartime came at Valley Forge in the winter of 1777 to 1778. Facing brutal conditions and dwindling supplies, George Washington's Continental Army constructed hundreds of cabins to house soldiers through the winter. These rough log structures, hastily built by men using axes and whatever tools they could find, provided minimal comfort but essential shelter. Within their cramped walls, soldiers endured hunger, disease, and cold. Yet Valley Forge became a symbol of resilience and unity. The cabins, standing in rows across the frozen landscape, represented the determination of the Revolutionary cause to endure against overwhelming odds. Cabins also played roles in diplomacy and negotiation. Treaties between colonial powers and indigenous nations were sometimes discussed or signed in cabin settings, where their walls provided neutral ground for difficult conversations. At times, cabins were repurposed as trading posts or council houses, linking cultures through commerce and fragile diplomacy. In these moments, cabins became more than military or domestic structures. They were places where the fate of entire regions was debated and decided. In the era of westward expansion, cabins once again found themselves at the center of conflict. The War of 1812 fought across the Great Lakes and frontier territories, so cabins destroyed, occupied, and fortified. Settlers fleeing advancing armies often abandoned their homes, only to return later to find them burned. In the Black Hawk War of 1832 and other frontier conflicts, cabins became rallying points of militias and symbols of contested sovereignty. Each cabin destroyed or defended was part of a larger struggle for control of land and resources. Yet in times of peace, cabins served as the foundations of community and reconciliation. After conflict subsided, families rebuilt their homes, and cabins became symbols of resilience and renewal. They hosted religious services, schools, and communal gatherings that helped knit fractured communities back together. The same walls that had witnessed violence and fear could later echo with hymns, laughter, and the ordinary rhythms of life. This duality, the cabin as both fortress and hearth, illustrates a profound role in shaping frontier society. Cabins also shaped military strategy. Commanders understood that control of settlements, often little more than clusters of cabins, could determine supply lines and morale. During campaigns, armies frequently commandeered cabins for use as headquarters or storage depots. Officers sketched maps on cabin tables, while soldiers slept on cabin floors. The strategic use of cabins blurred the line between military and civilian life, reinforcing how deeply these structures were woven into the fabric of war. The Civil War brought yet another chapter in the cabin's wartime history. Although by then many rural families lived in frame houses or larger dwellings, cabins remained common in remote regions. They provided shelter for soldiers moving through backcountry areas and were sometimes destroyed in campaigns of total war. In Appalachia, where cabins remained widespread, the war fractured families and communities, with cabins housing Unionists, Confederates, and refugees alike. The image of the cabin, once a unifying national symbol, became entangled in the divisions tearing the country apart. In Canada, cabins were central to both military and economic conflict. During the fur trade wars of the 18th century, rival companies built cabins as trading posts, which were often fortified against attack. These cabins, scattered across remote rivers and lakes, became contested sites in a commercial battle that had military dimensions. They were raided, defended, and burned as the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company competed for dominance. Here, too, the cabin was both shelter and stronghold, commerce and conflict intertwined. The symbolic legacy of cabins in war and peace is complex. On one hand, they embody the resilience of ordinary people, enduring hardship and violence while holding on to hope. On the other, they reflect the realities of colonization, displacement, and the cost of expansion. Their walls sheltered soldiers and settlers, but also excluded those displaced by their construction. To see cabins only as heroic symbols is to miss the deeper truth. They were contested spaces, at once sanctuaries and battlegrounds. Even after their practical role faded with industrialization, the memory of cabins in wartime endured. In historical reenactments, museums, and memorials, cabins stand as reminders of sacrifice and struggle. At Valley Forge, reconstructed cabins draw millions of visitors, offering a glimpse into the hardships endured by Washington's army. These replicas are not just tourist attractions. They are symbols of resilience forged in fire and frost. They remind us that history was lived not in palaces or grand halls, but often in the rough wooden walls of cabins where ordinary people endured extraordinary times. In peace, too, the cabin remains a symbol of continuity. Families rebuilt, communities healed, and nations expanded, but the cabin's meaning endured. It remained the backdrop for births, marriages, and funerals, a constant in a world of upheaval. Its hearths glowed with firelight, its walls echoed with voices, and its doors opened to both neighbors and strangers. In war and peace alike, the cabin was a structure that held life together, fragile yet enduring. The story of cabins in war and peace is a story of paradox. They were homes and forts, shelters and targets, symbols of both hope and conflict. Their survival and memory reflects how deeply they were woven into the struggles of the frontier. To stand before a cabin today is to stand before history itself, to see the scars of conflict and the resilience of peace written into its timbers. Few images in American history have carried as much political weight as a log cabin. By the 19th century, it was no longer just a structure of survival. It had become a symbol of democracy itself. Humble, rugged, and accessible to all, the log cabin came to embody the ideals of self-reliance and equality. It was no accident that some of America's most influential leaders were remembered, celebrated, and even mythologized as cabin presidents. Their political careers were shaped by the narrative power of these wooden walls, transforming modest origins into national legends. The association of cabins with political identity emerged in the early 1800s, when frontier expansion dominated American life. Voters saw the log cabin as a direct connection to ordinary people, the farmers, laborers, and pioneers who made up the backbone of the Republic. In a nation eager to distinguish itself from Europe's aristocracy, the cabin stood as a clear counterpoint to palaces and estates. It was the architecture of equality, and politicians understood its symbolic value. Andrew Jackson, 7th President of the United States, was among the first leaders to link his image to frontier life. Born in 1767 in the Waxhaws region between North and South Carolina, Jackson grew up in a world of log cabins and backward settlements. Orphaned during the Revolutionary War, he rose from modest beginnings to become a lawyer, general, and ultimately president. Jackson's supporters celebrated his rugged background, contrasting it with the perceived elitism of earlier leaders from Virginia and Massachusetts. While Jackson himself did not dwell heavily on the log cabin in his campaigns, his rise marked the beginning of an era when frontier origins were a political asset rather than a liability. But it was William Henry Harrison's 1840 presidential campaign that cemented the log cabin as the most powerful political symbol of the 19th century. Harrison, a military hero known for his victory at the Battle of Tippecanoe, was in reality born into a wealthy Virginia family. Yet his opponents, attempting to belittle him, claimed that Harrison would be content to retire to a log cabin with a barrel of hard cider. What began as an insult was transformed by Harrison's supporters into a campaign of unprecedented scale. Across the nation, rallies featured log cabin replicas mounted on wagons and paraded through towns. Miniature log cabins appeared on campaign tokens, banners, and even bottles of cider. Newspapers published songs and poems celebrating Harrison as a log cabin candidate, a man of the people. The image resonated deeply with voters, particularly those on the expanding western frontier. Harrison's campaign demonstrated the immense political power of the log cabin myth. It could transform privilege into populism, elite backgrounds into humble narratives. The strategy worked. Harrison won the election in a landslide, though his presidency lasted only a month before his death in April 1841. The log cabin myth found its most enduring champion in Abraham Lincoln. Born in 1809 in a one-room log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky, Lincoln's childhood was marked by hardship, labor, and loss. His family moved frequently across Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois, always living on the margins of frontier settlement. Lincoln's rise from these modest beginnings to the presidency became one of the most celebrated stories in American history. The log cabin was not just a symbol in his case, it was reality. Lincoln himself spoke sparingly of his early life, often dismissing it as unremarkable. Yet political allies and biographers seize on his cabin origins as proof of his authenticity. During his 1860 presidential campaign, stories of the rail splitter from Kentucky spread widely, portraying Lincoln as a man whose strength and character had been forged in frontier cabins. The image of Lincoln as a cabin-born president became central to his legacy, immortalized in monuments and literature. His birthplace in Kentucky was later reconstructed as a national shrine, visited by millions who sought to connect with the humble beginnings of a leader who preserved the Union. Other presidents also invoked the cabin myth, whether or not their ties were genuine. James Garfield, born in 1831 in a log cabin in Ohio, proudly embraces origins. His campaign in 1880 celebrated him as the last president truly born in a log cabin, a fact that resonated with voters nostalgic for the frontier past. Garfield's rise from poverty to the presidency reinforced the enduring power of the cabin as a narrative of self-made success. The repeated invocation of cabins in presidential campaigns reflected broader cultural shifts. By the mid-19th century, the United States was industrializing rapidly, and urban centers were growing. Yet voters continued to idealize the frontier and its values of independence, simplicity, and resilience. The log cabin served as a bridge between past and present, reminding Americans of their rural origins even as a nation embraced modernity. Politicians understood that to align themselves with cabins was to align themselves with the people. The symbolism of the cabin presidents also shaped national identity. They reinforced the belief that America was a land where greatness could emerge from modest beginnings, where birth in a log cabin was not an obstacle but a credential. This narrative distinguished the United States from Europe, where leadership was often tied to aristocracy and inherited privilege. The cabin presidents embodied a democratic ideal, that leadership came not from wealth or lineage, but from character forged in the crucible of frontier life. Yet, as with much of the cabin mythology, there were contradictions. Harrison's cabin origins were largely invented, and even Lincoln's story was shaped and simplified to fit a national narrative. The hardships of frontier life were often romanticized, stripped of their harsher realities of poverty, disease, and displacement. The log cabin presidents were remembered not only for who they were, but for what the nation wanted them to represent, a story of resilience, equality, and opportunity. Despite these complexities, the log cabin presidents left a lasting imprint on American political culture. Their campaigns demonstrated the enduring power of symbols in shaping public perception. The image of the cabin, whether genuine or contrived, carried immense emotional weight, connecting leaders to voters across class and regional divides. Even today, references to humble beginnings in political campaigns echo the log cabin tradition, a reminder of the enduring legacy of these wooden walls. In the end, the cabin presidents embodied more than personal stories. They reflected a national longing for authenticity, a belief that true leadership arose from shared struggles rather than inherited privilege. Their cabins, real or imagined, stood as monuments to a democratic ideal that shaped American identity for generations. On the frontier, the log cabin was not only a symbol of settlement and survival, it was also the stage on which women carried out some of the most demanding and often overlooked labor of early life in America. While the cabin presidents and frontier heroes captured the headlines in the history books, it was women who sustained households, nurtured families, and ensured that daily life continued in conditions of extraordinary hardship. Their stories, less celebrated but no less important, reveal the indispensable role of women in shaping frontier society and in giving the cabin its true meaning as a home. Life for women in cabins was shaped by the constant struggle for survival. From dawn to dusk, their labor was unrelenting. The day began before sunrise with the preparation of food, often starting with grinding cornmeal, baking bread in Dutch ovens, or tending to stews that simmered over open hearths. Firewood had to be gathered, water hauled from wells or streams, and children cared for in cramped and smoky interiors. The fireplace, while a source of warmth, filled cabins with soot and ash, and women spent much of their time cooking, sewing, or spinning beside it. These daily rhythms defined frontier existence and demanded resilience, adaptability, and strength. Women's roles extended far beyond the domestic sphere. They were central to the construction and maintenance of cabins themselves. While men felled trees and raised walls, women plastered gaps with clay, organized interiors, and created order from chaos. Once walls stood, it was women who transformed a bare structure into a home, arranging furniture, managing food stores, and creating spaces of warmth and stability. In times of absence, whether due to hunting, war, or migration, women often shouldered the responsibility of maintaining the cabin alone. Their labor kept families alive when conditions turned hostile. On the frontier, isolation was one of the greatest challenges women faced. Cabins were often separated by miles of forest or prairie, leaving women to manage households with little outside support. Diaries and letters describe the loneliness of these lives, broken only by occasional visits from neighbors or communal events like quilting bees and barn raisings. For many women, the cabin was both sanctuary and prison, a place of safety, but also confinement, where the weight of survival pressed heavily. Despite this, women created networks of support, exchanging labor and knowledge, and building communities that ease isolation and forge bonds of solidarity. Childbirth was one of the most profound and perilous aspects of women's lives in cabins. Without access to doctors or hospitals, births were often attended only by midwives or neighboring women. Cabins became delivery rooms, their wooden walls bearing witness to the cries of mothers and newborns. Infant mortality was high, and complications could quickly turn fatal in such conditions. Yet the resilience of women in enduring these challenges, often multiple times in their lives, underscores their extraordinary role in sustaining frontier families. Each birth in a cabin represented not just survival, but continuity, the passing of life into a new and uncertain world. Women also played vital roles in education and the preservation of culture. In many frontier regions, formal schools were rare or non-existent, and it was women who taught children to read, write, and recite religious texts by the light of the fire. Hymns, lullabies, and folk tales were passed down orally, creating cultural continuity in households cut off from the larger world. The cabin, in this sense, was not only a shelter but also a classroom and a cultural archive, sustained largely by women's voices and hands. Frontier women were also healers, responsible for the health of their families in a world with little access to medicine. They gathered herbs, brewed teas, and applied poultices, drawing on both European traditions and knowledge learned from indigenous neighbors. Cabins often contained shelves lined with jars of dried plants, roots, and remedies, each representing a lifeline in the face of sickness and injury. Women's role as caretakers was both practical and symbolic. They were the keepers of life in an environment where survival was never guaranteed. The responsibilities of women extended into agriculture and economy as well. While men cleared land and hunted, women tended gardens, milked cows, raised poultry, and preserved food. The management of supplies was crucial, particularly during long winters when fresh resources were scarce. Women's labor ensured that families had enough to eat, enough fuel to burn, and enough clothing to endure. Their work was rarely recorded in official accounts, yet it was the backbone of survival in the log cabin world. In times of conflict, women faced dangers as acute as those faced by men. Cabins were often targeted during raids, and women were left to defend their families when men were absent. Accounts from frontier wars describe women loading muskets, tending the wounded, or even fighting to protect their homes. Their courage, though less frequently celebrated, was essential to community survival. These stories challenge the stereotype of women as passive figures, showing them instead as active participants in the defense and endurance of frontier life. Religion and spirituality also shaped women's roles within cabins. Many households placed religious texts and symbols near the hearth, and women often led prayers or hymns in the absence of ministers. The cabin became a spiritual center, where women nurtured faith as a source of strength against hardship. Their role in transmitting values and beliefs gave the cabin a moral foundation, reinforcing its symbolism as more than a shelter. It was a place of spiritual as well as physical survival. The symbolism of women in cabins also extended into national mythology. While political campaigns celebrated male leaders born in log cabins, literature and folklore often depicted women as the heart of the home. They embodied the ideals of sacrifice, devotion, and moral strength that underpinned the log cabin myth. In popular stories, the pioneer mother was portrayed as both nurturing and resilient, shaping the next generation while enduring unimaginable hardship. These narratives, though often idealized, acknowledge the central role of women in sustaining the frontier experiment. Yet the reality of women's lives was far more complex than the myth suggested. Cabins were places of strength, but also of struggle. Women bore heavy burdens, often without recognition, and their labor was invisible in the grand narratives of expansion and democracy. They navigated lives of unrelenting work, profound isolation, and constant danger, finding moments of joy and community amidst hardship. Their stories remind us that the cabin's symbolic power was not only in its walls but in the lives sustained within them. By the late 19th century, as cabins gave way to larger homes and towns, the memory of women's labor began to fade from public consciousness. Nostalgia for the frontier often romanticized cabins as places of simplicity and virtue, glossing over the relentless demands placed on women. Yet historical records, diaries, letters, oral histories, preserve glimpses of their lives. These accounts reveal reality as inspiring as it was harsh. Women who balanced resilience with tenderness, survival with culture, hardship with hope. Today, the legacy of women in cabins endures in the stories of families and communities. Museums and historical reconstructions increasingly highlight women's roles, ensuring that their contributions are not forgotten. The cabins themselves, preserved in parks and heritage sites, stand as silent witnesses to their labor. To walk into a reconstructed cabin is to imagine the women who once tended fires, soothed children, and bore the weight of survival within those wooden walls. Their stories are not side notes to history, they are its foundation. The story of women in cabins reminds us that history is not only shaped by generals and presidents, but by ordinary people who labored in extraordinary conditions. Their resilience gave meaning to the cabin as more than wood and stone. It became a home, a sanctuary, and a vessel of life sustained by the hands and hearts of women. The log cabin is often remembered as a defining image of the American frontier, a sturdy shelter rough-hewn from a wilderness, standing as a symbol of determination and survival. But for Native American nations, the spread of cabins carried very different meanings. They were not just houses. They were signs of permanent settlement, cultural conflict, and, ultimately, displacement. The story of cabins in Native America is one of collision between European traditions of log building and indigenous lifeways that had developed over centuries on the same lands. To understand the cabin fully, we must place it within this context of cultural exchange, adaptation, and resistance. Before Europeans arrived, native nations had developed diverse and highly effective forms of housing suited to their environments. In the eastern woodlands, longhouses built by the Iroquois Confederacy stretched for dozens of feet, housing multiple families under one roof. In the southeast, the Cherokee and Creek-built log houses with clay plaster, often more permanent than the cabins later celebrated by settlers. On the Great Plains, mobile teepee structures of buffalo hides provided flexibility for nomadic life, while in the Southwest, Pueblo peoples constructed multi-storied adobe dwellings that endured for centuries. Housing was never merely practical. It reflected social organization, climate, resources, and cultural identity. When European settlers brought log cabin traditions to North America in the 17th century, they encountered indigenous nations who already had deep architectural traditions of their own. For the Lenape, Shawnee, and others living along the Delaware River, the cabins introduced by Swedish and Finnish settlers were not alien but familiar in some respects. Native peoples had long used wood, bark, and clay in their building practices, and they quickly recognized the utility of log construction. In some cases, indigenous communities adopted cabins, blending them into their existing practices. This was especially true in regions where trade and cultural exchange were strong. Cabins could be easier to heat than bark houses in winter, and they provided durable storage for trade goods. But the cabin was also a marker of change, an indicator that Europeans were not temporary visitors but permanent settlers. Unlike wigwams or longhouses, which could be relocated or rebuilt as communities moved with the seasons, cabins declared ownership of land. Their notched corners and smoking chimneys signaled that forests and fields were being claimed, enclosed, and transformed. For native nations, this permanence often carried ominous implications. Each cabin erected on traditional hunting grounds or village sites represented a step in the erosion of mobility, territory, and sovereignty. Throughout the 18th century, as European settlement expanded into the Ohio Valley, the Appalachians, and beyond, the presence of cabins increasingly brought conflict. Settlers raised cabins as footholds on contested land, often without legal title or regard for indigenous claims. In turn, native warriors targeted cabins as symbols of intrusion. During Pontiac's rebellion in 1763, for example, frontier cabins were raided and burned across the Great Lakes region as native confederacies sought to push back against British and colonial expansion. For settlers, the cabin was a sanctuary. For native fighters, it was a target of resistance. Yet the story is not one of simple opposition. Many native communities engage in selective adoption of cabins, incorporating them into their lives on their own terms. Among the Cherokee, by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, log cabins became common. Cherokee leaders such as John Ross and Major Ridge lived in substantial log homes, blending European building styles with indigenous governance and culture. Cabins in Cherokee territory symbolized adaptation and negotiation, a way to assert permanence and sovereignty in a rapidly changing world. This adaptation, however, did not shield the Cherokee from displacement. Despite their adoption of cabins, farms, and schools, they were forced from their homelands during the Trail of Tejas in the 1830s, leaving behind log houses that testified to both their resilience and their dispossession. Cabins also played a role in the fur trade, which linked European settlers and native nations in complex economic relationships. Trading posts, often little more than fortified log cabins, became hubs of exchange where native hunters brought furs in exchange for tools, firearms, and cloth. These cabins were places of interaction, negotiation, and sometimes exploitation. They stood at the intersection of two worlds, serving as both bridges and barriers between native and European societies. In Canada, similar dynamics unfolded. Cabins built by French voyageurs and later by the Hudson's Bay Company became central to commerce with Cree, Ojibwe, and other nations. For indigenous trappers, these cabins were practical places to trade, rest, or winter, yet they also symbolized the spread of European power into northern forests. Each cabin marked the extension of trade networks that tied native economies to distant markets in Europe. For native peoples, this brought both opportunities and dependencies, reshaping lifeways and relationships with the land. The symbolism of cabins in Native America cannot be understood without acknowledging their role in displacement. As settlers spread westward under banner of manifest destiny, cabins proliferated across lands long inhabited by native nations. U.S. government policies encouraged this spread, granting settlers land through legislation such as the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 and the Homestead Act of 1862. Each cabin built under these policies was not just a home. It was a claim sanctioned by law, backed by military power, and enforced at the expense of indigenous peoples. The destruction of native villages, the clearing of forests, and the forced relocations that followed were all intertwined with the expansion of cabins across the continent. But within this narrative of conflict and loss, there are also stories of resilience and memory. Some native communities incorporated cabins into their traditions, while others resisted and held fast to older forms of housing that expressed continuity with their ancestors. Today, archaeological sites and oral histories preserve evidence of these encounters. Charred remains of cabins destroyed in raids, log structures built by Cherokee leaders, and trading posts that served as meeting grounds of cultures. These remnants remind us that the cabin was not a neutral structure. It was a contested space where identities, economies, and futures collided. The mythology of the log cabin in American culture often obscures these complexities. Political campaigns celebrated the cabin as the birthplace of democracy, while folklore cast it as a symbol of virtue and resilience. Rarely did these narratives acknowledge what the cabin meant for native nations: the loss of land, the disruption of traditions, and the imposition of foreign permanence on indigenous landscapes. To tell the full story of cabins in North America is to confront this tension, to see the cabin as both a shelter of survival and a marker of displacement. Even so, cabins also became places of cultural exchange. Within their walls, native and European families sometimes intermarried, blending traditions in daily life. Meals, tools, and stories were shared across cultural lines, creating hybrid communities that defy simple categorization. These cabins remind us that history was not only conflict but also adaptation, negotiation, and shared humanity. By the late 19th century, as frontier expansion slowed and native nations were forced onto reservations, the cabin's symbolic role shifted once more. For settlers, it became a nostalgic reminder of national origins, celebrated in literature and monuments. For native peoples, cabins carried more complex meanings, symbols of adaptation, but also of loss. In heritage sites today, reconstructed cabins often stand as memorials to frontier life, yet their presence also invites reflection on the deeper histories they represent. The story of cabins in Native America is therefore not one of simple opposition, but of complexity. Cabins were homes, trading posts, targets, and symbols. They were adopted, resisted, burned, and rebuilt. They represented survival for settlers and displacement for indigenous peoples. To look at a log cabin today is to see more than rough timber walls. It is to glimpse the layered histories of two worlds colliding, negotiating, and enduring. The log cabin has long been remembered as a symbol of perseverance and democracy, but during the era of westward expansion it also became a symbol of exploitation. As the United States grew across the continent, cabins dotted the advancing frontier, their walls marking the steady march of settlement. They were places of refuge and survival for settlers, but they also stood as monuments to displacement, environmental transformation, and the exploitation of both land and people. The story of cabins during expansion reveals not only the resilience of pioneers but also the cost borne by indigenous nations, enslaved laborers, and the natural world. The early 19th century was defined by the belief in manifest destiny, the conviction that Americans were destined to spread across the continent. Cabins became physical expressions of this ideology. Each log structure built on newly claimed land was not merely a home. It was a declaration of permanence, a marker that wilderness was being transformed into farmland, towns, and eventually states. From the Ohio River Valley to the Great Plains, cabins appeared wherever settlers pushed forward, standing as a first step in the long process of converting forests and prairies into a settled landscape. But this expansion came at enormous human cost. For native nations, cabins symbolized intrusion and dispossession. Each cabin raised by a settler was one more sign that traditional hunting grounds, sacred sites, and villages were being claimed. Treaties, often signed under duress, ceded lands to the U.S. government, and cabins quickly followed surveyors and soldiers into these territories. The Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, collectively known as the 5 civilized tribes, adopted many aspects of European-style housing, including cabins, in an effort to coexist. Yet despite this adaptation, they were forced from their homelands during the Trail of Tejas in the 1830s. The cabins they left behind became haunting reminders of a broken promise, that adopting the ways of settlers could secure peace. Expansion also brought exploitation of labor. Cabins were built not only by pioneer families, but also by enslaved African Americans who worked the frontier alongside white settlers. On plantations pushing westward into Kentucky, Tennessee, and beyond, enslaved people raised cabins both for themselves and for their enslavers. These cabins, often cramped and poorly constructed, housed families under brutal conditions. While planter homes were larger and more elaborate, slave cabins lined the peripheries of plantations, their walls bearing witness to lives of toil and endurance. These structures remind us that the symbolism of the cabin as freedom and equality was, for many, a hollow myth. The spread of cabins also coincided with the exploitation of natural resources. Building cabins required felling trees, and frontier settlement consumed vast forests at staggering rates. In the Appalachians, the Ohio Valley, and later the Great Lakes region, entire woodlands were cleared to provide logs for homes, fuel for fires, and farmland for crops. Cabins marked the edge of this transformation, the first cut into landscapes that would soon be reshaped entirely. To settlers, this clearing represented progress. To later generations, it revealed the enormous environmental cost of expansion. The cabin's role in expansion was also deeply tied to violence. As settlers raised cabins, they often did so under protection of forts and militias. In regions like the Ohio Valley, frontier cabins were frequent targets during conflicts with native nations resisting displacement. Raids and reprisals turned cabins into both sanctuaries and battlegrounds, their walls scarred by musket fire or burned in retaliation. The cycle of violence underscored how deeply cabins were entangled in the struggle for land. Yet for settlers themselves, cabins symbolized hope and independence. Many were drawn westward by the promise of land under policies such as the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 and the Homestead Act of 1862. These laws encouraged migration by offering parcels of land to those willing to settle and improve them. Building a cabin was often the first requirement to establish a legal claim. Thus, cabins were not only shelters, they were proof of ownership, documents of timber and sweat that secured a family's place on contested soil. The Homestead Act in particular illustrates how cabins were entwined with expansion and exploitation. Signed into law by Abraham Lincoln in 1862, the act granted 160 acres of land to settlers willing to live on and cultivate it for 5 years. Millions of acres of indigenous land were open to settlement under this policy, and cabins sprang up across the Great Plains. For homesteaders, these cabins represented opportunity and freedom. For native peoples, they represented yet another stage of dispossession. The image of the homesteader's cabin, often celebrated in art and literature, cannot be separated from the forced removal of communities whose lands were being claimed. The exploitation of cabins as symbols extended into politics and culture. Politicians invoked the log cabin to portray themselves as men of the people, while ignoring the realities of those excluded from this narrative. Folklore celebrated the pioneer family raising a cabin in the wilderness, but seldom mentioned the enslaved hands that built them or the indigenous families displaced by them. The cabin became a powerful myth, celebrated in campaign songs and popular stories, even as its reality was far more complex and contested. Cabins also played a role in the economic exploitation of the frontier. Trading posts, often little more than fortified cabins, became centers of commerce where native hunters exchanged furs for goods. These posts drew indigenous economies into global markets, creating dependencies that undermined traditional lifeways. For fur companies, cabins were profitable outposts. For native communities, there were both opportunities and threats, reshaping relationships to land and resources. Despite these contradictions, the cabin endured as a symbol of resilience. Settlers clung to them through harsh winters, crop failures, and isolation. They stood as monuments to human determination, even as they also represented broader systems of exploitation. The duality of the cabin, shelter and symbol, hope and dispossession, captures the complexity of expansion itself. By the late 19th century, as the frontier closed, the log cabin was already being remembered with nostalgia. Literature, art, and political rhetoric celebrated cabins as the birthplace of democracy and the foundation of national identity. Yet the voices of those displaced, exploited, or silenced by their spread were rarely included. To tell the story of expansion honestly is to acknowledge both sides, the hope cabins gave to settlers and the loss they signified for others. Today, preserved cabins on historic sites across the United States and Canada remind us of this dual history. Visitors see rough-hewn logs, stone fireplaces, and small windows, but they also stand on land shaped by centuries of conflict and displacement. These cabins are not just relics of pioneer life. They are monuments to the complexities of expansion, the resilience of families, and the costs borne by those pushed aside. The log cabin, so often remembered as a simple symbol of democracy and freedom, was in reality entangled in exploitation at every level of land, of labor, of culture. To see it clearly is to see both its promise and its price. The log cabin was never just timber and stone. As settlers spread westward, it entered the realm of myth, transformed in stories, songs, and literature into something far larger than its physical form. The cabin became a vessel for ideals, freedom, simplicity, equality, woven into the fabric of American identity. It appeared in folklore, political rhetoric, and children's tales, celebrated as a cradle of democracy and the heart of the wilderness. But the myths that surrounded cabins often obscured the harsher realities of frontier life, replacing hardship with nostalgia and conflict with romanticism. The origins of these myths can be traced to the 18th and 19th centuries, when the frontier dominated the American imagination. Writers and storytellers cast a log cabin as the essential symbol of the pioneer experience. In their accounts, cabins stood as solitary outposts of civilization, carved from forests by determined men and women. These stories emphasize self-reliance, bravery, and moral virtue. They celebrated the cabin not just as a shelter but as a beacon of progress, a place where wilderness was tamed and democracy took root. Folklore figures like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett became central to this mythology. Boone, a skilled woodsman who helped open Kentucky to settlement in the late 18th century, was often depicted as a cabin dweller who balanced wilderness skill with civilized virtue. In reality, Boone lived in a series of cabins, but also spent much of his life moving restlessly across frontiers, often driven by debt and displacement. Crockett, who lived in Tennessee cabins and later died at the Alamo, was celebrated in stories and songs as a quintessential log cabin hero. In popular imagination, these men and their cabins symbolized the courage of the frontier spirit, even as the realities of their lives were far more complicated. Children's literature also played a central role in shaping the cabin myth. In the mid-19th century, writers like Caroline Kirkland and later Laura Ingalls Wilder created stories of frontier families living in log cabins. Wilder's Little House in the Big Woods and its sequels, published in the 1930s and 1940s, cemented the image of the cabin as a place of warmth, family, and moral lessons. Though based on her own childhood, Wilder's books softened the harshness of frontier life, presenting it as an almost idyllic world of resourcefulness and family unity. For generations of readers, these stories defined the log cabin as a symbol of innocence and resilience. The political use of the cabin myth amplified its cultural power. As we saw with William Henry Harrison and Abraham Lincoln, the claim of being born in a log cabin became shorthand for democratic authenticity. Songs, pamphlets, and speeches portrayed cabins as a starting point for greatness, proof that America's leaders were drawn from the common people rather than the privileged elite. The image was so powerful that even candidates with wealthy backgrounds embraced it, borrowing the symbolism to appeal to voters. The log cabin, in politics, became less about reality and more about narrative. The myths of the wilderness extended beyond politics and folklore into the broader culture. Artists painted cabins nestled in forests or perched on prairies, often bathed in golden light, as emblems of simplicity and harmony with nature. Poets and novelists described them as sanctuaries of virtue, where families lived in honesty and independence. These cultural images helped create a nostalgic memory of the frontier, even as industrialization transformed the nation. The cabin became a touchstone for a disappearing past, idealized precisely because it was fading. Yet beneath the myth lay harder truths. Life in cabins was often brutal. Disease, hunger, and isolation were constant threats. Smoke from fireplaces blackened lungs, cramped quarters spread illness, and winters brought freezing nights despite the glow of fire. Women labored endlessly in smoky interiors. Children died in infancy, and families lived in constant fear of crop failures or attacks. For indigenous peoples, cabins marked intrusion and dispossession, each new structure a reminder of lost land. These realities rarely enter the mythology. Instead, stories replace them with virtues of resilience and triumph, casting the cabin as a stage for moral lessons rather than suffering. The myths also erase the diversity of cabin life. African Americans, both enslaved and free, lived in cabins across the frontier, often under conditions harsher than those of white settlers. Enslaved families were confined to small, poorly-built cabins on plantations, their labor sustaining the agricultural economy. Yet their cabins, too, were places of family, culture, and resilience, even if these stories rarely entered the mainstream myth. The mythology of the log cabin as democratic cradle ignored the exclusion of millions from its promise. Despite these omissions, the power of the cabin myth lay in its ability to unify. It provided a common symbol that Americans of many backgrounds could rally around. Whether in children's books, political campaigns, or folklore, the cabin stood for values that resonated deeply: self-reliance, independence, and the possibility of rising from humble beginnings. The fact that the reality was harsher only made the myth more appealing, offering comfort and nostalgia rather than confrontation with truth. In the 20th century, the log cabin myth found new life in popular culture. Walt Disney's productions of Davy Crockett in the 1950s revived frontier imagery for a mass audience, with Crockett's coonskin cap and log cabin home becoming iconic symbols for a new generation. Country music celebrated cabins as places of simplicity and authenticity, contrasting them with the complexities of modern life. Tourism embraced the image, with log cabin resorts offering nostalgic escapes into mythologized wilderness. The cabin, once a practical necessity, had become a cultural commodity, yet the endurance of these myths reveals something deeper about the human relationship to wilderness. The log cabin represented a balance between nature and culture, a place where humans could live close to the land while still asserting control over it. In a rapidly industrializing and urbanizing nation, this balance carried immense symbolic power. It reassured Americans that they remained connected to their rural origins, even as cities and machines reshaped daily life. The cabin myth functioned as a cultural anchor, grounding identity in an imagined simplicity. At the same time, the persistence of the myth raises critical questions. Whose stories were told through the cabin? Whose were silenced? To celebrate cabins as cradles of democracy while ignoring the dispossession of native peoples or the exploitation of enslaved labor is to tell only part of the story. The myths of the wilderness gave meaning and pride, but they also obscured injustices that shaped the very world those cabins stood upon. Today, historians and educators grapple with these dual legacies. Reconstructed cabins at historic sites invite visitors to imagine frontier life, but many also include exhibits that highlight the complexity behind the myths. Stories of indigenous displacement, enslaved labor, and women's unrecognized contributions are increasingly included alongside the familiar tales of pioneers and presidents. The cabin myth is not abandoned, but expanded, no longer a simple symbol of virtue, but a more nuanced reminder of struggle, resilience, and contradiction. The myths of the wilderness endure because they speak to universal human desires, the longing for simplicity, the pride and resilience, and the hope that greatness can rise from humble beginnings. The cabin embodies these desires, even when reality was harsher. Its walls enclosed not only families but also stories retold until they became national legends. To separate myth from reality is not to diminish the cabin, but to understand it more fully as both a stage for ideals and a witness to history. The log cabin is often remembered as a cradle of democracy, a symbol of self-reliance and humble beginnings. Yet for those who actually lived within its rough-hewn walls, the cabin was often a symbol of poverty as much as pride. Cramped, smoky, and dark, these homes bore witness to hardship, illness, and deprivation. At the same time, they stood as evidence of endurance, a place where families persevered against odds that might otherwise have crushed them. The cabin's legacy, therefore, is not one of simplicity alone, but of contradiction, where poverty and pride coexisted in equal measure. For many frontier families, cabins represented necessity rather than choice. They were quick shelters, built because there was no alternative. With only axes and manpower, settlers could raise walls within days, using trees cut from the surrounding forest. The resulting structures were often small, 15 by 20 feet, a single room serving as kitchen, bedroom, and gathering space for entire families. Light filtered weakly through tiny windows, sometimes covered only with grease paper. Floors were date, later replaced with puncheon planks split from logs. Smoke from open fireplaces filled interiors, irritating eyes and lungs. To live in such conditions was not romantic. It was survival stripped to its barest form. Cabins were also crowded. Families of 6, 8, or more often lived together in one room, sleeping in lofts or on straw mattresses near the hearth. Privacy was virtually non-existent, and chores filled every waking hour. Women cooked, spun, and mended by dim light, while men repaired tools or prepared hunting equipment. Children played in cramped spaces or helped with endless chores. Illness spread quickly in these confined quarters, and infant mortality rates were high. In the reality of daily life, cabins were not idyllic retreats. They were harsh reminders of the difficulties of subsistence living. Despite this, cabins also carry profound meaning as places of pride. For newly arrived immigrants, raising a cabin was the first step in transforming wilderness into home. Each notched log, each stone placed in a chimney, represented labor and determination. For families who had crossed oceans or traveled hundreds of miles, the cabin was proof that they had survived and claimed a foothold in a new land. To stand before a completed cabin was to see one's effort embodied in timber and stone, a visible marker of perseverance. The duality of poverty and pride was reflected in the way cabins were remembered. Settlers often wrote of their first homes with a mixture of hardship and affection. In memoirs and letters, many described the smoke-filled air, the leaks in roofs, the constant battle against cold. Yet in the same breath, they spoke of the satisfaction of building something with their own hands, of knowing that each log was evidence of their resilience. This tension gave the cabin its symbolic power. It was both a reminder of deprivation and a badge of accomplishment. Cabins also marked social status in complex ways. Among wealthier settlers, cabins were often temporary. Families began with a cabin, but quickly built larger frame houses or brick homes as soon as they could afford it. For poorer families, the cabin was permanent, a sign that they could not rise beyond subsistence. In this sense, cabins were associated with poverty, and in some regions, to live in a log cabin was to be considered of lower social standing. Yet paradoxically, in national rhetoric, the cabin was celebrated as a symbol of virtue and equality. This contrast between lived reality and cultural myth highlights the complexities of the cabin's legacy. The pride associated with cabins often emerged most strongly in times of reflection. As industrialization transformed the United States in the 19th century, nostalgia for the simplicity of cabin life grew. Writers, politicians, and reformers looked back on the log cabin as a symbol of honesty and authenticity, even as those who had lived in them remembered smoke, cold, and hunger. The distance between reality and memory allowed cabins to be celebrated as places of moral strength rather than hardship. The experience of enslaved African Americans adds another dimension to this story. On plantations across the South, cabins housed enslaved families, but these structures bore little the pride associated with pioneer cabins. They were often hastily built, cramped, and poorly insulated. Families endured overcrowding and squalid conditions, with little control over their living spaces. Yet even within these cabins, pride and resilience could be found. Enslaved families created homes as best they could, preserving culture, storytelling, and faith within walls meant to confine them. These cabins reveal the profound complexity of the log cabin symbol, places of oppression for some, yet still sites of family and community. Indigenous perspectives likewise complicate the cabin's legacy. For many native peoples, cabins represented loss, built on lands taken from their communities. Yet some indigenous nations adopted cabins, integrating them into their lives while maintaining traditions. Among the Cherokee and other groups in the Southeast, log cabins became part of a broader strategy of adaptation, a way to assert permanence and sovereignty in the face of encroachment. These cabins embodied both survival and dispossession, making them symbols of cultural resilience even amid overwhelming pressure. Cabins were also tied to education and literacy, which became sources of pride. In remote settlements where schools were scarce, families sometimes turned cabins into makeshift classrooms. Teachers instructed children by firelight, often with little more than a Bible and a slate. The same smoky interiors that witnessed hardship also nurtured learning, ambition, and dreams for the future. For many families, education achieved in cabins symbolized hope, the possibility of rising beyond the limitations of frontier poverty. The cabin's place in memory was also shaped by its association with political figures. Abraham Lincoln's story, in particular, transformed the cabin from a marker of poverty into a badge of pride. Lincoln himself spoke frankly about the deprivation of his early life in a Kentucky cabin, but political allies reframed his story as one of triumph. His rise from poverty to the presidency made the cabin a symbol of opportunity, proof that greatness could emerge from the humblest of origins. In this narrative, poverty became pride, and hardship became the foundation of democratic identity. Literature and folklore further romanticized the cabin, emphasizing pride while downplaying poverty. Stories of pioneers depicted cabins as places of warmth, family unity, and moral lessons. The reality of smoke-filled lungs and hunger was set aside in favor of narratives of resilience and virtue. By the late 19th century, nostalgia had firmly transformed the cabin into a cultural icon, celebrated in art, song, and public memory. But the truth remains more complicated. For many who lived in them, cabins were symbols of poverty, of limited opportunity, and of relentless labor. They were places where families endured the harshest conditions, where children died young, and where survival was never certain. At the same time, they were also symbols of determination, of families who refused to give up, who took pride in what they could build with their own hands. This dual legacy is what gives the cabin its enduring power. Today, preserved cabins across North America embody this contradiction. Visitors step into small, dark rooms and marvel at the hardship endured by past generations. At the same time, they are invited to admire the strength and pride of those who lived within them. The cabin remains a symbol that carries both meanings at once: poverty and pride, deprivation and resilience. To understand the cabin is to accept this complexity. It was never only a symbol of democracy or hardship, but both. It represents the struggles of the poor, the pride of survival, the resilience of enslaved and indigenous families, and the triumphs of leaders who rose from humble origins. Its legacy endures because it holds together these contradictions, reminding us that history is never simple, and that pride often grows from the hardest soil. The log cabin is most closely associated with the American frontier, but its story is far older and far wider. Across the world, in forests stretching from Scandinavia to Siberia, from Canada to the Balkans, timber dwellings served as humanity's front line against wilderness. These cabins, huts, and wooden houses were not identical, but they shared a common purpose: to provide security, warmth, and permanence where survival demanded resourcefulness. Looking beyond America reveals how cabins were part of a global tradition, each shaped by local environments, cultures, and histories, yet united by the same human need for shelter in the face of nature. The roots of log construction are most deeply embedded in northern Europe. Scandinavia, with its vast forests of pine, spruce, and birch, gave rise to centuries-old traditions of wooden architecture. By the early Middle Ages, Norwegians and Swedes had perfected the art of stacking logs with interlocking notches to create sturdy, weather-resistant homes. These structures were known for their durability, often standing for generations in harsh climates. The iconic Norwegian stabber, or storhace, elevated on wooden stilts to keep food dry and safe from pests, demonstrates the ingenuity of Scandinavian woodcraft. Churches, too, were built of timber, most famously the stave churches of Norway, with steep gables and intricate carvings that survive to this day. These buildings were not cabins in the American sense, but they illustrate how timber became central to Northern European life and identity. In Russia, the izba emerged as a dominant form of rural housing for centuries. Constructed of pine or birch logs, izbas were simple in design but rich in cultural meaning. Their interiors often centered on a massive stove, which provided heat and a place to cook during long Siberian winters. Over time, izbas became closely tied to spiritual traditions. Icons of saints were placed in a corner known as a beautiful corner, transforming the cabin into both a home and a sacred space. Russian peasants decorated the exteriors with carved window frames and eaves, blending practicality with artistry. For millions of families, the izba was the axis of rural life, representing continuity and community in a land of vast distances and extreme cold. Siberia, conquered and colonized by Russia from the 16th century onward, became another frontier of cabins. As Cossacks, traders, and peasants moved eastward, they brought the izba with them, building villages and trading posts deep in the forests. Cabins in Siberia were often larger and sturdier than their American counterparts, designed to endure temperatures that could plunge far below zero. These structures became symbols of Russia's eastward expansion, marking the gradual settlement of land stretching to the Pacific Ocean. Much like in North America, cabins in Siberia represented both survival and colonization, offering refuge for settlers while signifying the displacement of indigenous Siberian peoples. In Central and Eastern Europe, log cabins also played a vital role in rural life. In the Carpathian Mountains, peasants in present-day Slovakia, Poland, and Ukraine built wooden houses using similar notching techniques to those of Scandinavia. These homes were often whitewashed with lime and adorned with decorative motifs, combining practicality with beauty. In the Balkans, particularly in Serbia and Montenegro, Brvner log houses were constructed with steep roofs to shed heavy snow, standing as symbols of mountain resilience. Across these regions, log cabins were associated not with myth but with necessity, built by subsistence farmers whose lives revolved around the cycles of the land. Canada, too, was shaped by cabins, long before American pioneers carried the log cabin westward. French voyagers, fur traders, and missionaries of the 17th and 18th centuries built log cabins as outposts across Quebec, Ontario, and the Great Lakes. These cabins were not only shelters but hubs of commerce, linking indigenous hunters with European markets. The Hudson's Bay Company established countless trading posts, many little more than fortified cabins, that became critical nodes in the global fur trade. For indigenous nations such as the Cree, Ojibwe, and Innu, these cabins were both opportunities for exchange and symbols of intrusion. As in the United States, the Canadian cabin was a site of cultural encounter, where survival, trade, and conflict converged. Beyond the northern forests, variations of cabins appeared in other frontier regions. In Japan, mountain communities built wooden farmhouses called minka, designed with steep thatched roofs to withstand heavy snowfall. In the Himalayas, Tibetan farmers constructed timber and stone houses adapted to alpine conditions. In South America's Andean highlands, Spanish colonists introduced timber-framed houses, which blended with indigenous stone traditions. While not log cabins in the strict sense, these structures reveal the universality of wood as a material of survival, shaping human adaptation across diverse landscapes. The global story of cabins is also one of symbolism. Just as a log cabin in America became a symbol of democracy and self-reliance, in Russia the Izba symbolized tradition and spirituality, while in Scandinavia wooden houses express continuity with nature and craftsmanship. In Canada, the cabin symbolized commerce and colonization, standing at the intersection of Indigenous and European worlds. Everywhere, cabins represented more than survival. They became carriers of identity, symbols of resilience, and reflections of cultural values. Despite their global spread, cabins also carried similar contradictions. In every frontier where cabins appeared, they signified both settlement and displacement. They represented the determination of families to endure, but also the expansion of empires at the expense of indigenous peoples. In this way, cabins across the world share a common dual legacy. They are remembered with pride and nostalgia, but they also stand as reminders of conquest and loss. By the 20th century, the cabin had shifted from necessity to nostalgia in many parts of the world. In Scandinavia, summer cottages, often built of timber, became symbols of leisure rather than survival. In Russia, dachas, country houses with roots in the Izba tradition, provided urban dwellers with retreats to the countryside. In Canada and the United States, cabins evolved into vacation homes and hunting lodges, celebrated as escapes from modern life. Around the globe, cabins once associated with poverty and hardship became reimagined as places of simplicity, peace, and harmony with nature. To look at cabins across the world is to see both diversity and unity. Each culture shaped its cabins to meet its environment, its traditions, and its needs. Yet everywhere, these wooden walls tell similar stories, of families seeking warmth against the cold, of communities carving permanence from forests, of human beings negotiating the boundary between wilderness and home. The cabin is not just an American symbol. It is a universal one, rooted in the oldest human struggle for shelter and belonging. By the mid-19th century, the log cabin, once the most recognizable symbol of frontier life, began to fade from the living landscape. The advance of industrialization, the spread of railroads, and the growth of cities reshaped the way people built, lived, and imagined their homes. Cabins, once essential to survival on the edge of settlement, were increasingly replaced by frame houses, brick dwellings, and mass-produced structures. What had once been necessity now became memory. The story of industrialization and the vanishing cabin is not only about architecture, it is about how technology, economy, and culture transformed the meaning of shelter itself. The Industrial Revolution changed every aspect of building. Sawmills, once scarce on the frontier, became widespread as rivers powered machines that could turn raw logs into uniform planks. Where cabins had required notched logs and hand labor, frame houses could now be erected with milled lumber and standardized nails. This shift was profound. Instead of rough-hewn walls built from trees felled on site, families could construct larger, more polished homes from cut lumber purchased at growing towns and cities. The cabin, once the mark of permanence, now appeared crude and outdated compared to new houses with glass windows, shingled roofs, and painted exteriors. The railroad accelerated this transition. By the 1850s and 1860s, rail lines carried milled lumber, bricks, shingles, and manufactured goods deep into former frontier regions. Settlers who once relied solely on local forests for building materials could now purchase prefabricated components shipped from distant factories. Entire towns sprang up along railroads, their houses reflecting standardized styles rather than the improvisation of cabins. The log cabin, bound to the era of isolation, seemed increasingly out of place in a world knit together by steel rails and industrial supply chains. Urbanization also contributed to the cabin's decline. As population shifted towards cities in search of industrial work, fewer families lived in remote rural areas where cabins remained practical. In urban and suburban settings, cabins were nearly absent, replaced by brick row houses, Victorian homes, and tenements. The architectural landscape of the industrial age had little room for the rough log structures that once defined the frontier. Cabins lingered in remote corners, but their symbolic roles shifted, from homes of necessity to reminders of a passing era. Yet industrialization did not erase the cabin entirely. Instead, it transformed its meaning. By the late 19th century, nostalgia for the vanishing frontier grew stronger. Writers and artists celebrated cabins as emblems of a simpler, purer time, contrasting them with the complexity and corruption of industrial cities. Politicians continued to invoke the log cabin as a symbol of humility and democratic origins, even as fewer Americans lived in them. The cabin's physical presence dwindled, but its symbolic power grew. This nostalgia was fueled by rapid change. Industrialization brought prosperity for some, but it also created overcrowded cities, labor unrest, and stark inequalities. The cabin, remembered as a place of independence and simplicity, offered comfort in an age of uncertainty. In literature, cabins were cast as the settings of moral virtue. In monuments, they became shrines to national identity. The very fact that cabins were vanishing made them more powerful in memory. Preservation efforts reflected this shift. Abraham Lincoln's log cabin birthplace was reconstructed in the early 20th century, enshrined as a national symbol. At expositions and fairs, replica cabins drew crowds eager to glimpse the nation's humble origins. These structures were often romanticized, presenting cabins as tidy, orderly, and comfortable, far removed from the smoky, drafty, and cramped realities of frontier life. The industrial age turned the cabin into a museum piece, a stage set for nostalgia. At the same time, cabins found new life in different contexts. In rural regions, especially in Appalachia and the upper Midwest, poor families continued to live in cabins well into the 20th century. For them, the cabin was not nostalgia but necessity, a mark of poverty rather than pride. Social reformers and journalists often highlighted these cabins as evidence of inequality, contrasting them with the prosperity of industrial America. In this way, cabins took on dual symbolic roles, celebrated in memory as symbols of democracy, while in reality representing hardship and deprivation for those left behind by progress. The industrial age also brought the first stirrings of a cabin revival. As cities grew crowded and polluted, middle-class Americans began seeking escapes into nature. Writers like Henry David Thoreau, who famously lived in a small cabin at Walden Pond in the 1840s, provided inspiration for later generations who sought simplicity away from industrial life. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, cabins were being reimagined as retreats, summer cottages, and hunting lodges. They no longer symbolized survival but leisure, an ironic transformation, as what had once been poverty now became luxury for those who chose it voluntarily. In Russia, similar patterns unfolded. As industrialization spread, the traditional izba declined in prominence, replaced by brick and stone houses in towns and cities. Yet in rural villages, izbas remained common, continuing to embody traditions and cultural continuity. Much like in America, the izba became a symbol of national heritage, celebrated in folklore and preserved in museums even as it faded from daily life. The vanishing of cabins was not simply architectural, it was cultural. The transition from cabins to industrial homes marked a broader shift from self-sufficiency to dependence on markets and factories. Where frontier families once built with their own hands, industrial-age families increasingly purchased their homes or relied on contractors. This shift reflected not only technological change, but also a change in values. Independence, once symbolized by cabins, was now tied to participation in the industrial economy. Still, the memory of the cabin proved remarkably durable. Even as they disappeared from the landscape, cabins remained potent symbols of authenticity, democracy, and nostalgia. In political rhetoric, in children's literature, and in heritage tourism, they retained a presence far greater than their numbers suggested. The very fact that they had vanished from everyday life made them safe to remember, idealized, simplified, and stripped of their contradictions. By the early 20th century, the cabin existed in two worlds, as a relic of poverty for those still living in them, and as a romantic symbol for those who look back on them from the comfort of industrial homes. This tension defined the cabin's legacy in the industrial age. It was disappearing from reality, but it was thriving in imagination. The story of industrialization and the vanishing cabin reminds us that history is never just about progress or loss. It is about transformation. Cabins, once essential to survival, became unnecessary in a world of railroads and factories. Yet they endured in memory, reshaped by nostalgia into symbols of authenticity and simplicity. Their disappearance from the landscape did not end their story. Instead, it gave them a new life, as myths of the past, anchors of identity, and reminders of the resilience that had carried families through the hardest years of the frontier. By the time the 20th century dawned, the log cabin was already slipping into history. No longer the standard dwelling of pioneers or the first step of a settler family, it had become something else entirely, a memory. Yet it was not a simple memory of rough-hewn survival. The cabin came to represent a vision of the past, carefully shaped, retold, and celebrated in ways that suited the needs of a modernizing nation. To understand cabins in American memory is to see how myth, nostalgia, and heritage blended to transform modest homes into enduring cultural icons. The memory of the cabin was most powerful because it spoke to national origins. Politicians, educators, and writers used it to frame the story of the United States as one of humble beginnings and democratic ideals. In speeches and campaigns, the log cabin was invoked as the birthplace of greatness. The image of presidents born in cabins, Abraham Lincoln most famously, was repeated endlessly as proof that America was a land of opportunity. The cabin was less about timber walls and about the story those walls told. That poverty could give rise to power, that simplicity was the soil of virtue. Preservation played a central role in shaping this memory. In 1909, for the centennial of Lincoln's birth, his cabin was reconstructed inside a neoclassical memorial at Hodgenville, Kentucky. Though historians later revealed that the logs were not authentic, the symbolic power of the cabin was undiminished. Visitors flocked to see it, not for its material accuracy but for what it represented. Across the country, cabins associated with pioneers, presidents, and folklore heroes were reconstructed, often idealized and sanitized. These sites invited Americans to step back into a past that was simpler, purer, and more heroic, at least in memory. Museums and World's Fairs also embraced the cabin as a symbol. At the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, replicas of frontier cabins were displayed to celebrate the nation's humble beginnings. Later fairs repeated the pattern, presenting cabins as living exhibits of progress. In these contexts, cabins were no longer homes but artifacts, curated to tell a specific story of national identity. They stood for perseverance, virtue, and democratic equality, while the harsher realities of frontier life, poverty, disease, displacement, were largely omitted. Popular culture amplified these myths. In the early 20th century, children's books like Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House series depicted cabin life as wholesome, moral, and filled with adventure. Wilder's stories, based on her childhood, soften the brutal realities of survival and emphasize family unity, resilience, and moral lessons. For generations of readers, these books define the cabin as a place of warmth and virtue, creating nostalgic memories of a frontier many had never known. Hollywood, too, contributed, portraying cabins as backdrops to tales of courage and romance. The cabin in memory became less a record of history and more a stage for national ideals. Tourism further embedded cabins into memory. By the 1920s and 1930s, as automobiles opened travel across the country, log cabin motels, restaurants, and attractions appeared along highways. These roadside cabins bore little resemblance to the rough shelters of the frontier, but the name evoked nostalgia and authenticity. Families traveling in modern cars and staying in manufactured cabins were, in a sense, buying a piece of frontier memory. The log cabin, once a marker of necessity, was now a brand. This romanticized memory coexisted with harsher associations. For African Americans, the memory of cabins was often tied not to frontier freedom but to slavery. Enslaved families lived in small, rough cabins on plantations, their lives defined by forced labor and deprivation. These cabins became sites of endurance and community, but also a profound injustice. For many descendants, the memory of cabins carried pain rather than pride. In recent decades, historic preservation has increasingly acknowledged these histories, ensuring that the cabin in memory reflects a full spectrum of experience, not only the celebrated myths. Indigenous perspectives complicate the memory further. For native nations, cabins were often symbols of dispossession, representing the encroachment of settlers onto their lands. The romanticization of cabins in American memory rarely acknowledged the villages burned, the territories lost, or the cultures displaced to make room for those structures. Today, museums and heritage sites are beginning to tell these stories more fully, recognizing that the cabin in memory is incomplete without acknowledging its role in colonization. Despite these complexities, the cabin remains central to American memory because it spoke to enduring values. It symbolized hard work, simplicity, and independence. In an age of industrialization and urbanization, when cities grew crowded and technology accelerated life, the cabin represented an anchor to a past of authenticity. It reassured Americans that their national character was rooted not in aristocracy or privilege, but in sweat, determination, and survival. Even if few people still lived in cabins, nearly everyone could claim their symbolism. This memory extended into politics well into the 20th century. Candidates continued to invoke humble origins, often likening them to cabin stories, even if the actual structures were long gone. The cabin remained shorthand for authenticity, for being one of the people. Its power endured not because it reflected reality, but because it resonated with aspiration. By the mid-20th century, the cabin's place in memory shifted again, as it became associated with leisure and escape. Middle-class Americans, weary of urban life, built or rented cabins in the woods as vacation retreats. These modern cabins, equipped with electricity and conveniences, bore little resemblance to the rough shelters of pioneers. Yet the name carried nostalgia, evoking simplicity and closeness to nature. In this way, the cabin continued to live in memory, even as its physical form evolved. The endurance of cabins in memory reveals a human need to shape history into stories that comfort, inspire, and unify. The real cabins of the frontier were often cramped, cold, and smoky. They were places of hardship, disease, and relentless labor. But in memory, they became places of virtue, simplicity, and pride. This transformation does not erase the reality. It highlights how memory works, smoothing rough edges, amplifying ideals, and creating symbols larger than life. Today, preserved cabins across the United States serve as sites of memory. Visitors walk into their small, dark rooms and imagine frontier life, often guided by narratives that emphasize resilience and simplicity. Increasingly, However, these sites also tell fuller stories, acknowledging the diversity of cabin experiences. Settlers, indigenous peoples, enslaved families, women, and children. The cabin in American memory is no longer only a symbol of triumph. It is also a reminder of complexity. The cabin's endurance and memory proves its power. Though it has nearly vanished from daily life, it remains alive in stories, museums, literature, and even commercial culture. To step into a cabin today is to step into memory, not only of frontier survival, but of the ideals, contradictions, and myths that have shaped American identity. Few symbols have traveled from physical reality into cultural imagination as seamlessly as a log cabin. Once a practical solution to survival on the frontier, it became a powerful emblem in stories, novels, plays, and eventually films. Literature and cinema transformed the cabin from a rough-hewn dwelling into a stage where national myths, moral lessons, and popular fantasies could unfold. Through these mediums, the cabin's meaning grew beyond wood and stone. It became a metaphor for democracy, simplicity, and authenticity, while also carrying darker associations of poverty, slavery, and conflict. The first wave of cabin literature appeared in the early 19th century as Americans sought to craft a national identity distinct from Europe. Writers such as Washington Irving, James Fenimore Cooper, and Caroline Kirkland set stories in cabins that reflected both hardship and heroism. Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales, including The Last of the Mohicans, 1826, depicted cabins as outposts of civilization on the edge of the wilderness. They were fragile sanctuaries, often threatened by war and violence, yet symbolic of moral courage and the pioneering spirit. Kirkland, In a New Home, Who'll Follow, 1839, offered a more realistic portrayal, describing the hardships of Michigan frontier life with unflinching detail. These early depictions reveal the dual nature of the cabin in literature, both idealized and starkly real. Perhaps the most influential literary cabin was that of Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Stowe's novel, which galvanized anti-slavery sentiment in the United States, centered on the life of enslaved African Americans whose homes were small cabins on southern plantations. Unlike the romanticized pioneer cabins of folklore, these cabins symbolize oppression and endurance. They were places of family and faith, yet overshadowed by the brutality of slavery. Stowe's work ensured that cabins would forever be tied not only to frontier democracy, but also to the memory of bondage and injustice. As the 19th century progressed, children's literature continued to shape the cabin myth. Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House in the Big Woods, 1932, and the subsequent Little House series presented frontier cabins as places of warmth, family unity, and moral lessons. Based on Wilder's childhood in Wisconsin and the Midwest, the book softened the realities of frontier hardship, turning them into narratives of resilience and virtue. For generations of readers, the cabin became a nostalgic symbol of childhood innocence and simplicity, far removed from the harsher truths of survival. Folklore heroes also carry the cabin myth into popular imagination. Stories of Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett often place cabins at the center of their adventures, presenting them as launching points for exploration into the wilderness. By the mid-20th century, Walt Disney's Davy Crockett series, 1954 to 1955, brought these tales to television, making the coonskin cap-wearing frontiersman and his cabin part of mainstream American culture. Disney's production cemented the cabin as an image of rugged independence, broadcast into millions of homes during a time when suburban houses were replacing cabins in reality. Film further expanded the symbolism of cabins. Westerns, one of the dominant genres of early American cinema, often used cabins as visual shorthand for the frontier. In films like The Big Trail, 1930, starring John Wayne, cabins appeared as outposts of civilization, fragile defenses against wilderness and violence. They provided settings for moments of domesticity amid chaos, emphasizing the contrast between the stability of family and the unpredictability of the frontier. In other films, cabins became sites of siege and struggle, representing the cost of expansion and the conflict that defined settlement. Cabins also appeared in darker contexts in film. In adaptations of Uncle Tom's Cabin, enslaved families' cabins were depicted as cramped, humble dwellings overshadowed by oppression. These portrayals emphasize the dual legacy of cabins in American history as symbols of democracy and freedom for some and symbols of inequality and bondage for others. The cabin's ability to carry such divergent meanings made it a powerful cinematic tool, capable of evoking nostalgia, hardship, or injustice depending on context. By the mid-20th century, cabins had become fixtures of horror and suspense genres as well. Films like Night of the Living Dead, 1968, and later The Evil Dead, 1981, used isolated cabins in the woods as settings for fear and violence. In these stories, the cabin was stripped of its nostalgic associations and recast as a place of vulnerability, where isolation turned from resilience into terror. This transformation reveals a cabin's cultural flexibility. It could symbolize safety and democracy in one context, and fear and entrapment in another. In literature, the cabin continued to serve as both nostalgic symbol and critical lens. Writers in the 20th century often revisited the cabin to explore themes of authenticity, simplicity, and alienation from modern life. Henry David Thoreau's cabin at Walden Pond, described in Walden 1854, became an enduring symbol of self-reliance and reflection, inspiring generations of readers seeking escape from industrial society. Though Thoreau's cabin was modest and short-lived, its literary impact was profound, elevating the cabin into a philosophical ideal rather than merely a practical dwelling. African-American writers also revisited the cabin's symbolism. Works such as Richard Wright's Black Boy, 1945, and later historical studies explored the realities of life in cabins under slavery, reclaiming narratives often overshadowed by romanticized frontier stories. These accounts emphasize resilience in the face of systemic injustice, ensuring that cabins remain complex symbols in literature, places of suffering but also of survival and community. Global literature and film likewise engage with cabin symbolism. Russian novels often depicted the Izba as a site of peasant life, blending hardship with spirituality. Films set in Siberia portrayed cabins as markers of endurance in harsh climates, paralleling American frontier narratives. Scandinavian writers celebrated wooden houses as expressions of cultural continuity, while Canadian literature often placed cabins at the heart of wilderness survival tales. Across the world, the cabin remained a stage for exploring themes of simplicity, survival, and cultural identity. In contemporary culture, cabins continue to appear in film and literature, often with nostalgic or ironic undertones. In independent cinema and novels, cabins symbolize retreat from modernity, a return to nature and authenticity. At the same time, they are used in thrillers and horror films as places of isolation, where comfort turns to danger. This dual role underscores the cabin's enduring symbolic power. It can evoke comfort or fear, democracy or oppression, depending on the story being told. Ultimately, the presence of cabins in literature and film demonstrates how deeply they are woven into cultural imagination. They are not merely historical artifacts, but living symbols, constantly reinterpreted to reflect the values and anxieties of each generation. From Stowe to Wilder, from Disney to horror cinema, the cabin has served as a canvas for national myths, moral lessons, and cultural critiques. The cabin endures in literature and film because it speaks to universal human experiences. It represents shelter and survival, but also identity, authenticity, and memory. Whether as a birthplace of presidents, the home of folklore heroes, or the site of terror in the woods, the cabin carries meanings far beyond its timber walls. In stories and on screens, it continues to shape how people imagine the past, interpret the present, and dream about authenticity in a modern world. The log cabin, once the indispensable shelter of pioneers, has undergone one of the most remarkable transformations in architectural and cultural history. What began as a symbol of necessity and survival has become, in the modern era, a marker of leisure, nostalgia, and even luxury. To understand the cabin today is to explore how a structure rooted in hardship has been reimagined as a retreat from modern life, an emblem of authenticity, and a commercial product. It is also to see how the cabin continues to carry the laid legacies of poverty, democracy, and dispossession, even as it stands in new forms across North America and beyond. In contemporary America, cabins are rarely built for survival. Instead, they are constructed as vacation homes, tourist lodgings, or symbolic retreats. Families rent cabins near lakes, mountains, or forests, seeking to escape the pace of cities and suburbs. These cabins are often equipped with electricity, plumbing, and internet access, luxuries unimaginable to pioneers. Yet the appeal lies less in the amenities than in the illusion of simplicity. To spend a weekend in a cabin is to step, however briefly, into a world imagined as closer to nature, slower, and more authentic than modern life. The rise of tourism in the 20th century played a major role in this transformation. By the 1920s and 1930s, roadside log cabin motels dotted American highways, offering travelers a nostalgia of frontier imagery while providing modern comforts. These cabins bore little resemblance to their historical counterparts, yet the name and design evoke authenticity. The association between cabins and leisure continued to grow in the post-war era, when rising incomes and automobile culture allowed families to vacation in cabins by national parks, lakes, or ski resorts. Today, platforms like Airbnb market cabins as unique getaways, blending rustic charm with modern convenience. At the same time, the cabin has remained a powerful symbol of escape and independence. Writers, artists, and thinkers continue to embrace cabins as spaces of reflection. Henry David Thoreau's cabin at Walden Pond, though built in the mid-19th century, continues to inspire those seeking solitude and simplicity. Modern environmentalists and minimalists draw on the cabin as a model for sustainable living, promoting tiny houses and off-grid cabins as alternatives to consumer culture. In these contexts, the cabin is not just nostalgia. It is a philosophy, a deliberate rejection of excess in favor of simplicity. But cabins today are not only rustic retreats. In many places, they have become luxury commodities. High-end cabins in mountain resorts feature hot tubs, floor-to-ceiling windows, and design interiors. Marketed as cabins, they carry the symbolism of simplicity while offering the comforts of affluence. This ironic twist underscores the cabin's cultural flexibility. Once a sign of poverty, it is now associated with wealth and exclusivity. A log cabin in the 21st century may cost far more than a suburban house, transforming the symbol of democracy into a marker of privilege. Despite this transformation, cabins continue to serve as dwellings for those in rural poverty. In part of Appalachia, the Ozarks, and remote northern regions, families still live in log or timber cabins not out of choice but out of necessity. These cabins often lack modern amenities, echoing the conditions of earlier centuries. Social workers and journalists document these homes as evidence of enduring inequality in America. Hey, the cabin retains its dual symbolism, nostalgia for some, hardship for others. The cabin today also carries environmental meaning. As climate change and sustainability become pressing concerns, cabins are often presented as models of eco-friendly living. Off-grid cabins powered by solar panels, built from reclaimed timber, are designed as tiny houses attract those seeking to reduce their environmental footprint. These modern cabins echo the resourcefulness of pioneers while reflecting contemporary values of conservation and minimalism. In this sense, the cabin continues to evolve, bridging the past and the future. Globally, cabins retain similar symbolic power. In Scandinavia, summer cottages, often built of timber, serve as family retreats, passed down through generations. In Russia, dachas, many of which resemble traditional izbas, provide urban residents with escapes to the countryside. In Canada, lakeside cabins remain central to cultural identity, blending Indigenous French, and British traditions of wilderness living. Across the world, the cabin persists as a structure that connects people to nature, memory, and identity, even in the modern age. The persistence of cabins in popular culture reinforces their place in the present. Films, novels, and advertising often use cabins as settings for stories of simplicity, romance, or suspense. Horror films, in particular, have turned the isolated cabin into a trope, symbolizing both vulnerability and primal fear. At the same time, tourism campaigns highlight cabins as escapes from stress, offering tranquility and authenticity. The cabin in the modern imagination is at once comforting and unsettling, nostalgic and contemporary. Importantly, cabins today are also sites of historical reflection. Preserved cabins at heritage sites remind visitors of the hardships of earlier generations. Museums increasingly present fuller stories, including those of indigenous displacement and enslaved families who lived in cabins under oppression. These interpretations challenge a romanticized myth of the past, ensuring that the cabin today is not only a tourist retreat but also a place of learning. In the 21st century, the cabin stands at a crossroads of symbolism. It is a luxury item, a retreat, a relic, and a reminder of poverty. It is embraced by environmentalists as a model for sustainability, by politicians as a symbol of authenticity, and by families as a nostalgic escape. Few structures have carried so many meanings across so many centuries. The cabin's endurance reveals not only its adaptability, but also the deep human need to root identity in shelter, simplicity, and survival. To speak of the cabin today is to speak of paradox. It is celebrated as rustic, even when built with modern technology. It is sold as simple, even when it embodies luxury. It is remembered as democratic, even when it excludes the stories of those displaced or enslaved. Yet precisely because of these contradictions, the cabin remains powerful. It reflects the complexity of history and the multiplicity of meanings we attach to home. The log cabin has never truly vanished. It has shifted from necessity to nostalgia, from survival to symbol, from poverty to privilege. Today, it continues to evolve, carrying with it the legacies of those who built, lived, and dreamed within its walls. The cabin story is far from over. It lives on in memory, in tourism, in literature, in film, and in the choices people make about how and where to live. Above all, it remains a reminder of humanity's enduring bond with wood, fire, and shelter, the most basic elements of survival transformed into symbols of culture and identity. The log cabin has always stood at the intersection of reality and imagination. It was once a practical necessity for settlers, immigrants, enslaved families, and indigenous communities, an environment of smoke, labor, and survival. Yet as the frontier receded and cabins disappeared from daily life, they became powerful myths. They shifted from lived reality to cultural memory, reshaped into symbols of democracy, equality, and authenticity. The cabin as myth and memory is not simply about nostalgia for a vanished past. It is about how societies use symbols to explain who they are, where they came from, and what values they hold most dear. The myth of the log cabin emerged in the 19th century, when the United States was still defining itself as a nation. Unlike Europe, with its castles, palaces, and cathedrals, America turned to the cabin as a founding symbol. It was humble, accessible, and democratic. It declared that greatness did not come from privilege but from perseverance. Politicians eagerly embraced this narrative. William Henry Harrison's 1840 presidential campaign, branding him the log cabin candidate, set the template for using cabins as political mythology. Abraham Lincoln's origins in a Kentucky log cabin solidified the association. Lincoln's story was powerful not only because it was true, but because it embodied the national ideal, the rise from poverty to leadership through hard work and character. Yet myth always simplifies. The harsh realities of cabin life, hunger, disease, infant mortality, isolation, were softened or erased in popular memory. In stories, cabins glowed with warmth and family unity. In reality, they were often sites of suffering. The transformation of cabins into myths reflected a broader cultural need to find inspiration in the past, even if that meant reshaping it. Cabins became symbols of virtues people wanted to believe in, not necessarily reflections of the lives actually lived within them. Memory further solidified the myth. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, cabins were reconstructed at historic sites, preserved in museums, and celebrated in literature. Lincoln's birth cabin in Kentucky, reconstructed from unrelated logs and enshrined in a neoclassical temple, drew millions of visitors. These memorials were less about accuracy than about meaning. They invited Americans to connect emotionally to the cabin as a symbol of national origins. Cabins became heritage, curated to tell a specific story of democracy and resilience. The cabin as myth also appeared in literature and popular culture. Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House books turned the frontier cabin into a place of family virtue and moral lessons, cementing its role in childhood imagination. Folklore heroes like Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone were depicted as cabin dwellers, embodying rugged independence. Hollywood films and Disney productions broadcast these images to mass audiences, ensuring that the cabin myth remained central to American culture well into the 20th century. These stories did not erase hardship entirely, but they framed it as part of a triumphant narrative. Suffering was temporary, resilience permanent, and the cabin the vessel of both. At the same time, the cabin's myth carried silences. For indigenous nations, cabins symbolized displacement, each log structure marking encroachment onto ancestral lands. For enslaved families, cabins on plantations were places of endurance but also confinement, their memory tied to oppression rather than freedom. These perspectives rarely entered the mainstream myth, which celebrated the cabin as a democratic cradle while overlooking the inequalities it embodied. Only in recent decades have these stories been more fully included in heritage sites and scholarship, complicating the memory of the cabin and expanding its meaning beyond a single narrative. Memory also transformed the cabin into a nostalgic escape. As industrialization and urbanization reshaped society, the cabin became a symbol of simplicity and authenticity. Middle-class Americans built or rented cabins as vacation homes, seeking to reconnect with a past they imagined as purer and closer to nature. The cabin myth, once rooted in survival, became a commodity, sold as leisure. In this transformation, poverty was rebranded as simplicity and hardship as charm. The cabin as myth and memory reveals how history is always selective. Societies remember what they want to celebrate and forget what complicates the story. The cabin was remembered as a birthplace of democracy, but rarely as a marker of inequality or displacement. Yet memory evolves. Today, more inclusive narratives acknowledge that cabins were lived in by diverse communities, each with their own experiences. Cabins symbolize pride and hardship, freedom and oppression, survival and dispossession. Their myth endures not because it is simple, but because it is adaptable. Globally, similar processes unfolded. In Russia, the Izba was remembered as a symbol of rural tradition, celebrated in folklore and preserved in museums even as villages modernized. In Scandinavia, timber houses became national heritage, associated with craftsmanship and continuity. In Canada, cabins were remembered both as fur trade outposts and as family retreats, blending histories of commerce, colonization, and nostalgia. Everywhere, cabins moved from necessity to memory, celebrated in ways that reflected cultural identity. In the 21st century, the myth of the cabin remains alive. Politicians still invoke humble beginnings. Writers and filmmakers continue to set stories in cabins, whether nostalgic, romantic, or terrifying. Tourists seek cabins as escapes, buying into a memory of simplicity. Meanwhile, historians and educators work to tell fuller stories, ensuring that the myth does not erase reality. The cabin today is not just a building, but a symbol layered with centuries of memory, of hardship, resilience, democracy, and contradiction. To speak of the cabin as myth and memory is to recognize that it is both true and untrue. Cabins were real, lived in, endured, but they were also stories, shaped by the needs of those who remembered them. They were places of poverty and pride, oppression and opportunity. They endure in memory not because they were easy to live in, but because they gave meaning to lives and to nations. The myth of a cabin will continue as long as people seek authenticity, simplicity, and stories of humble origins. The story of the log cabin is, at its heart, the story of humanity's search for shelter, identity, and meaning. What began as rough walls stacked in haste to guard against wind and cold has become one of the most enduring cultural symbols in history. Cabins were homes of necessity, forged in forests and prairies by settlers, immigrants, enslaved families, and indigenous peoples. They were places of poverty and hardship, but also of resilience and hope. Over time, they were reshaped into symbols, political tools, cultural myths, nostalgic retreats that far exceeded a material form. To conclude this journey is to see that the cabin has always been more than wood and stone. It has been an emblem of survival, a vessel of ideals, and a mirror of contradictions. From the earliest frontier cabins in the Americas to the izbas of Russia and the wooden cottages of Scandinavia, the cabin has expressed the human struggle against nature. Built from the most basic materials, cabins were never grand, but they endured. They offered shelter where none existed, light in darkness, warmth in bitter winters. Families raised children within their smoky walls, communities gathered at their hearths, and nations measured their progress by the spread of cabins across contested landscapes. The cabin's power lies in this universality. It was not unique to one culture or nation, but a recurring solution to the human need for survival. In the United States, the log cabin became more than a dwelling. It became a myth of national identity, celebrated as the birthplace of democracy. Politicians claim cabins as their origin stories, casting themselves as men of the people. Abraham Lincoln's cabin stood at the center of this narrative, enshrined as proof that greatness could rise from the humblest beginnings. Yet even as cabins were celebrated, their realities were harsher than the myth suggested. Families endured hunger, isolation, and disease. For indigenous nations, cabins marked dispossession. For enslaved families, cabins were places of endurance under oppression. To conclude the story honestly is to hold all these truths together. The cabin was freedom for some, captivity for others, opportunity for many, and loss for those displaced. The cabin's disappearance from daily life during industrialization only strengthened its symbolic power. As cities grew and railroads spread, cabins became nostalgic emblems of authenticity. They were preserved in museums, reconstructed at World's Fairs, and retold in literature and film. Children read about them in Little House books, while moviegoers saw them in westerns or Disney productions. They became stages for morality, adventure, and even horror. The cabin in memory was never just a building. It was a canvas of the values and anxieties of each generation. Today, cabins continue to evolve. They are marketed as vacation getaways, luxury lodges, eco-friendly retreats, and minimalist homes. They appear in advertisements promising simplicity and in horror films warning of isolation. They remain in poor communities as markers of inequality, even as they reappear in affluent settings as symbols of leisure. This paradox reveals their enduring power. The cabin is adaptable, shifting meaning depending on context. It is never fixed. It is always a reflection of what people want it to be. But perhaps the most important lesson of the cabin is that memory and myth are inseparable from history. To remember cabins only as places of virtue and democracy is to erase the hardship, exploitation, and displacement tied to them. To remember them only as sites of suffering is to overlook the resilience, pride, and hope they inspired. The cabin is both. Its walls contain contradictions, poverty and pride, oppression and freedom, suffering and survival. This duality is why the cabin endures in memory. It speaks to the complexity of human history, refusing to be simplified into a single meaning. In conclusion, the cabin teaches us that history is not only about grand monuments or powerful leaders. It is about ordinary families who raised walls against the cold, who tended fires through long winters, who endured loss and celebrated survival. It is about the unseen labor of women, the resilience of enslaved families, the adaptation of indigenous peoples, and the ambitions of settlers. It is about how those stories were later remembered, reshaped, and retold to serve new purposes. The cabin is more than wood and stone. It is a symbol of humanity itself, fragile yet enduring, humble yet profound. And so the cabin remains, standing in forests, preserved in heritage sites, or remembered in books and films. It continues to carry meaning. To step into a cabin today is to step into history, myth, and memory all at once. Its smoke-stained walls whisper survival, its hearth glows with stories of resilience, and its image endures as a reminder that greatness, hardship, and identity can emerge from the simplest of shelters. The log cabin may have vanished from daily necessity, but in memory it will never disappear.